Hello, my friend. Whatever brought you here tonight, I'm so glad you're here. So make yourself comfortable, leave today's worries where they are, and let's spend a peaceful evening together exploring another corner of history. If these quiet journeys into the past have ever helped you relax or drift off to sleep, a like and a subscribe help this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you settle in, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a peaceful evening in Tennessee, a little village somewhere in the Cotswolds, or a cool night just outside Perth with the windows cracked open. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I really do read every single one. Now get comfortable. You don't have to do anything except listen. Just stay here, with me. Comfortable? Good. Let us begin. It is not yet light outside. That is the first thing to understand about this particular morning, in this particular village. In a year we might place somewhere in the 1300s, though the exact date hardly matters to the woman who is about to open her eyes. What matters is the cold. It is the kind of cold that has settled into the room overnight and taken up residence there. A cold that lives in the corners and under the blankets and in the stone of the hearth, waiting to be pushed back by fire and by will. The cottage is small, one room mostly, with a loft above where the older children sleep, and a partition of woven willow separating the sleeping area from the rest. The walls are wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches packed with a mixture of mud, straw and dung, whitewashed on the inside with a wash of lime that has gone grey with years of smoke. The roof is thatch, thick as a sheep's fleece, and right now it is doing its quiet work of keeping the frost outside where it belongs. Her name is Agnes, though her husband sometimes still calls her by the shortened, affectionate version his own mother used for her once, years ago, back when they were both still young and newly married. She's perhaps 30 years old, though she could pass for older or younger depending on the light, the way most people her age and station can. She's been married to Thomas for 12 years now, a man who works the strips of land their family holds under the local lord, and together they have 4 children living, which is itself a kind of quiet victory in a world where not all children live. The eldest is Will, 11, already sleeping in the loft with the confidence of a boy who thinks himself nearly a man. Below him in age is Alice, 8, sharp-eyed and endlessly curious about things she has not yet been taught. Then there is little Margaret, 5, who still sleeps pressed against her mother's back most nights out of habit more than need. And in a woven basket lined with wool sits the newest one, Edmund, not yet 4 months old, who has finally, mercifully, learned to sleep through until the birds start. Agnes opens her eyes before any of them stir. She does this every morning, has done it for years now, and her body no longer needs to be told. There is a particular quality to pre-dawn darkness that she has come to know intimately. A deep blue black that is not quite the black of midnight, carrying in it some faint promise of the light that has not arrived yet. She lies still for a moment, just breathing, feeling the warmth of Thomas beside her and the small huddled shape of Margaret at her back, and there is something in that stillness worth noticing. It is the last stillness she will have for many hours. She knows this, and she does not resent it. She simply notices it, the way you might notice the last quiet moment before a door opens onto a busy street. The fire is her first task, and it is not a small one. Overnight the household fire has been banked, buried under a thick layer of ash to keep the embers alive without burning through their limited supply of wood. This is a skill in itself, one Agnes learned from her own mother, who learned it from hers. You do not simply let a medieval fire go out and relight it fresh each morning, not if you can help it, because striking a new fire from flint and steel and char cloth takes time and effort that nobody wants to spend before the sun is even up. So instead, the fire sleeps, and now it is her job to wake it. She slides out from under the blankets with the practiced quiet of someone who has done this 10,000 times, feet finding the cold, packed earth floor without stumbling, without waking Margaret, without waking anyone at all. She crosses to the hearth, which sits roughly in the centre of the room, no chimney to speak of, just a hole in the thatch above where the smoke eventually finds its way out, taking its slow and lazy time about it. She kneels. The ash is soft and grey and cool on the surface, but she knows, because she's done this so many times, that underneath there is still warmth, still life. She uses a small iron tool, little more than a bent rod, to gently rake back the ash, and there they are. Small orange eyes glowing faintly in the dark, the embers that have survived the night on almost nothing at all. This is the part that requires patience, not strength. She adds tinder first, dry moss and shredded bark that she gathered and kept dry precisely for this purpose, and she leans close and breathes on the embers, slow and steady, the way you might coax a shy animal closer. The embers brighten. A thread of smoke rises, then catches, then a small flame appears, hardly bigger than a fingernail, but it is there and it is enough. She feeds it carefully, small twigs first, then slightly larger ones, watching the way the light plays across her hands and across the packed earth floor, and there is something almost tender about the whole process, the way you might tend to something fragile and new. Within a few minutes she has a proper fire going, and the room begins to fill with that particular orange glow that will be its main source of light for most of the day. I find myself genuinely admiring this part of her morning, honestly. There is no dramatic flourish to it. No one is watching her do it, and yet the entire household depends on this fire surviving the night and being coaxed back to life each morning, because it is not just for warmth. It is for cooking, for boiling water, for the small measure of light that makes everything else possible in a world without electricity. If she fails at this task, the whole day shifts, becomes harder, colder, slower. She does not fail at it. She has not failed at it in longer than she can remember. With the fire established, she's already moving to her next task because there is no pause built into this morning. Not really, not until much later. She takes up 2 wooden buckets, worn smooth at the handles from years of use, and steps outside into the grey hush before sunrise. The air outside is sharp enough to wake anyone fully, and it smells of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from the handful of other cottages already stirring nearby. The village is small, perhaps 30 families scattered along a single rutted track, their cottages clustered close together for warmth and company and safety, with the fields stretching out beyond in long narrow strips that belong to no one and everyone at once, depending on how you think about medieval land tenure. Agnes walks the familiar path toward the stream that runs along the eastern edge of the village, her breath visible in front of her, her wooden clogs making a soft, hollow sound against the frozen ground. She is not the only one awake. Somewhere off to her left, a rooster has decided the day has officially begun, and a dog barks once, half-heartedly, before falling silent again. Narrow and barely knee-deep in most places, the stream itself runs clear and cold, fed by hills a few miles distant, and it is the lifeblood of the entire village in a way that is easy to overlook if you have never had to fetch your own water. Agnes kneels at the bank, breaks a thin skin of ice that has formed overnight along the edges, and fills her first bucket. The cold bites at her hands immediately, and she works quickly, filling the second bucket before her fingers go entirely numb. This will not be her only trip, it rarely is. A household like hers, with 5 people and a cow and a handful of chickens and pigs to consider, might need this walk 4 or 5 times before the day is through, and each round trip is not exactly a stroll. Carried water is heavy, it sloshes, it strains the shoulders and the lower back in a way that modern people, turning on a tap, would find almost impossible to imagine. She's not alone at the water's edge this morning. Another woman, older, a widow named Cecily, who lives 2 cottages down, is already there filling her own vessel, and the 2 exchange a few quiet words, the kind of low, murmured conversation that happens between people who know each other's rhythm so well they barely need full sentences. Cecily mentions that her hens have not been laying well this week. The cold has put them off it, and Agnes nods and says something about trying warm mash, and that is the whole conversation, and somehow it is enough. This is one of the quiet mechanisms of village life that rarely gets mentioned in the grander histories. Women meeting at the well or the stream, exchanging small pieces of practical knowledge, checking in on each other without ever quite naming it as checking in. It is how news travels. It is how help gets offered, quietly, before it is even asked for. By the time Agnes makes her way back to the cottage, first light has begun to creep along the eastern edge of the sky, a pale grey band low on the horizon that will not become proper daylight for another half hour or more. She sets the buckets just inside the door and immediately turns to the next task, because the fire needs water set over it now if breakfast is to happen at anything resembling a reasonable hour. And here is the thing about medieval mornings that surprises people. There is no leisurely transition from waking to working. There is no cup of something warm sipped slowly while the world wakes up around you. The waking and the working are essentially the same motion, one continuous unbroken stream of tasks that begins the instant her eyes open and does not meaningfully pause until well after dark. Thomas is stirring now, and she hears him shift in the bed behind the partition, and there is a low exchange of words between them, brief and practical, about whether the ground will be workable today or whether last night's frost will have made the soil too hard for the ploughing he had planned. This is not romance, not in the way we might picture it. It is partnership. It is two people who have built an entire life together out of small daily negotiations about weather and work and what needs doing first. And there is a kind of intimacy in that which is easy to miss if you are looking for something more theatrical. Breakfast, such as it is, will not be elaborate. This is not a household that eats eggs and bacon each morning, not on an ordinary day. More often it is pottage, a thick stew of grains and whatever vegetables are on hand, sometimes with a scrap of bacon or salted meat for flavour, if there is any to spare, kept simmering over the fire and eaten with hands or a wooden spoon from a shared bowl. But before pottage can happen, there is the matter of the grain itself, and this is where Agnes's morning takes a turn that modern listeners often find genuinely startling. There is no mill close enough to visit every single day, and even where a village mill exists, using it often comes with a fee paid to the lord, a portion of the flour handed over simply for the privilege of grinding grain there. Many households, Agnes's included, keep a quern at home for smaller daily needs, a set of two flat circular stones, one sitting atop the other, with a hole in the centre of the upper stone and a wooden handle set near its edge. She kneels beside it now, pours a measure of dried grain, barley mostly, sometimes mixed with a little rye, into the hole at the centre, and begins to turn the handle in slow, steady circles. This is hard, repetitive, physical work, the kind that leaves a particular ache across the shoulders and forearms if you're not used to it, and Agnes has been doing it most mornings of her adult life. The stones grind against each other with a low, grating rhythm, and the flour trickles out from between them in a fine pale dust that collects in a cloth spread beneath. It takes a genuinely long time to produce even a modest amount this way, and there is something almost meditative in the repetition of it, though I doubt Agnes thinks of it in those terms. To her it is simply Tuesday or Wednesday. The days blur together in their sameness, punctuated mainly by which saint's day falls when, or whether it is market day, or whether the weather has decided to make everything harder than usual. While her hands work the quern, her mind is already elsewhere, moving through the mental list of everything else that needs doing before the sun has fully risen. This is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is easy to imagine medieval life as somehow simpler than our own, less cluttered with obligation, and in some ways that might be true. But Agnes carries in her head, at every moment, an inventory that would exhaust most modern people simply to read aloud. The cow needs milking before it grows uncomfortable. The chickens need feeding, and their eggs need collecting before something else finds them first. The children need waking, and Edmund especially will want feeding soon, his hunger arriving with the punctuality of the tide. The bread that rose overnight needs shaping and baking. Water needs boiling. And beyond all of that, somewhere in the back of her mind sits the longer list, the seasonal one, the mental calendar of what needs preserving and mending and gathering depending on what month it happens to be. She finishes the grinding, sets the flour aside, and moves to check the dough that has been resting near the warmth of the hearth since the previous evening, covered with a damp cloth to keep it from drying out. Bread in a household like this is not made fresh every single day in the way we might picture from a period drama kitchen. It depends heavily on the season and on access to an oven, because many peasant households did not have their own proper baking oven, relying instead on a shared communal oven maintained by the village, or on baking flatter loaves directly on a hot stone, or in a covered pot set into the coals of the hearth fire. Agnes's family is fortunate enough to have a small clay oven built into the side of the hearth, a low domed structure that Thomas's father built decades ago, and it is one of the small daily conveniences that makes her life marginally easier than some of her neighbours. Pulling back the cloth, she finds the dough has risen well overnight, thanks to the leaven she keeps going in a small covered crock, a portion of fermented dough saved from the last batch and fed with a bit of flour and water each time, the ancestor of what we might now call a sourdough starter, though nobody in this village would call it that. She works the dough briefly on a wooden board, shapes it into a round, dense loaf, and slides it into the oven, which she banked with coals earlier, and which now holds a steady, even heat. The whole cottage begins to fill with the smell of baking bread, warm and slightly sour and deeply comforting, mixing with the wood smoke already hanging in the air, and if there is a single smell that defines this household, this hour of the morning, it might be that combination. Bread and smoke, and something faintly animal, the wool of blankets warming near the fire. It is around this point that little Margaret wakes, padding out from behind the partition, rubbing her eyes, drawn by the smell of bread, the way children have always been drawn by that particular smell in every era of human history. Agnes does not stop what she is doing to fuss over her. There is not time for that kind of mourning, not really. Instead, she simply says good morning without looking up fully, tells Margaret to fetch the wooden bowls from the shelf, and just like that, the child is folded into the rhythm of the household's work, given a small task that makes her feel useful rather than in the way. This, too, is how medieval children learnt everything they would eventually need to know, not through formal lessons, not for a household like this one, but through this steady daily absorption of watching and helping and gradually taking on more. Outside, the light has properly arrived now, that cool early morning light particular to autumn, pale in the way it falls this time of year, or perhaps closer to what early spring offers, the kind of season where the ground still remembers winter even as the days begin to stretch a little longer. Agnes leaves the bread to finish in the oven and steps back out, this time toward the small lean-to structure attached to the side of the cottage where the family keeps their single cow. Not every household in the village can afford a cow. Some share one between 2 or 3 families, working out an arrangement for milk and labour that requires a level of trust and bookkeeping, informal as it is, that would put some modern business partnerships to shame. Agnes's family is fortunate to have their own, a brown, patient animal they call, with the kind of unimaginative practicality typical of the era, simply cow. She settles onto a low 3-legged stool beside the animal, murmuring something low and wordless to calm her, and begins to milk, her hands moving in that particular rhythm that takes years to develop properly, a rhythm that looks effortless once mastered, and is anything but effortless in the learning. The milk hisses softly into the wooden pail, and steam rises faintly off it into the cold morning air, and there is something almost startling about that image if you have never seen it. Warm milk meeting cold air, a small visible cloud rising from something so ordinary. This milk will not simply be drunk fresh, though some small portion of it might be, particularly for the children. Most of it has a longer journey ahead of it. Some will be set aside to make butter later in the week, once enough has accumulated. Some will go toward a simple soft cheese, pressed and drained through cloth. Milk in this world is not a single product sitting on a shelf waiting to be consumed. It is a raw material that Agnes will transform, over the coming days, into several different things, each requiring its own knowledge, its own timing, its own small set of skills passed down and practiced until they became second nature. While she milks, her attention is not entirely on the cow. It rarely is entirely on any single task, actually, and this is perhaps one of the more underappreciated aspects of her competence. She is listening, half consciously, for sounds from inside the cottage, for Edmund's cry that will mean he is hungry, for the particular thump and shuffle that means Will has climbed down from the loft. She hears the chickens beginning to fuss in their small coop near the garden, and she knows without needing to check that they are hungry too, and that the eggs need collecting before a fox or a crow, or simply the chickens themselves manage to damage them. She finishes with the cow, sets the pail of milk safely to one side, covered against dust and curious animals, and moves next to the chickens, scattering a handful of grain and kitchen scraps across the small fenced area where they roost and scratch. The chickens crowd around her ankles with the particular fearless enthusiasm chickens have always shown toward the person who feeds them, and she moves among them, checking the small woven nesting boxes tucked along the coop's edge. This morning yields 6 eggs, which she counts with quiet satisfaction, a good number, better than yesterday, and she gathers them carefully into the fold of her apron before making her way toward the small enclosure where the family pig is kept. The pig is, in its own way, one of the most important economic assets this household has. Unlike the chickens, which produce eggs regularly and can occasionally be eaten themselves, the pig represents a single significant investment of resources that will pay off, quite literally, once a year when it is slaughtered in the late autumn and transformed into salted and smoked meat that will help carry the family through the leaner months of winter. Agnes feeds it scraps and whatever the garden and household can spare, not out of affection exactly, though there may be some of that too, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of what this animal represents for her family's survival over the coming cold season. She does not linger here. There is no time to linger anywhere this morning, not really, though the pace of her movements never feels frantic. It feels instead like someone who has done this exact sequence of tasks so many times that her body has stopped needing her mind's full attention for most of it, freeing up some quieter part of her thoughts to wander elsewhere even as her hands keep working. By the time she steps back inside, cradling the eggs, Edmund has begun to cry in earnest, that particular insistent wail that infants have always used to announce their needs across every century of human history. Agnes sets the eggs down carefully, wipes her hands on her apron, and lifts him from his basket, settling into the low chair near the fire to nurse him. And here, finally, is something that looks like a pause. It is not really a pause. Her body is still, but her mind continues its quiet inventory, and even now she is aware of the bread in the oven, aware that Will has still not come down from the loft, aware that Thomas is somewhere outside checking on tools before he heads to the fields for the day. But there is something genuinely worth sitting with in this moment, this brief window where the only task is holding her youngest child close to her body and letting him feed. Infant care in this world carries weights that are easy to forget from a comfortable modern distance. Child mortality was a real and constant presence in medieval life, and every mother of this era carried some awareness of it, whether spoken aloud or not. Agnes has buried one child already, a daughter who did not survive her first winter, some years before Margaret was born, and though she does not think of it every day, it lives somewhere in her, in the particular attentiveness with which she watches Edmund now, in the small private relief she feels each morning that he has made it through another night. This is not something she would ever say aloud to anyone, not even to Thomas, not in so many words. It simply shapes the quality of her care, quietly, the way a scar shapes the skin around it, without anyone needing to mention it. Will comes down from the loft now, moving with the particular clumsy confidence of an 11-year-old boy who believes himself nearly grown, and he is followed shortly by Alice, both of them drawn, as Margaret was before them, by the smell of bread and the general stirring of the household. There is a brief flurry of activity as the family gathers, Thomas coming back inside from the yard, stamping cold from his boots, and the bread is pulled from the oven, its crust dark and slightly cracked, and set to cool just enough to be handled. The pottage that has been simmering, thickened now with the fresh ground flour and flavoured with whatever vegetables were on hand from the autumn stores, is ladled into shared wooden bowls. They eat together, the whole family, sitting on benches drawn close to the fire, and it is not a leisurely meal by any modern standard. There is conversation, but it is practical, clipped, focused on the day ahead. Thomas mentions the state of the far field, whether it will need clearing of stones before the next planting. Will asks if he can go with his father today instead of tending the family's small garden plot, and receives a non-committal answer that both of them understand to mean maybe, we will see how the morning goes. Alice is given the task of watching Margaret for a stretch of the morning while Agnes handles the washing, and she accepts this with the particular seriousness that 8-year-olds bring to responsibilities they consider grown up. And here is a detail that tends to surprise people when they hear it for the first time. This entire elaborate sequence, the fire, the water, the grinding, the baking, the milking, the feeding, the collecting, the nursing, all of it, every single piece, has happened before what we might now consider a normal working breakfast hour. It is not yet what we would call mid-morning. Agnes has already done more physical, skilled, essential labour than most modern adults complete in an entire day, and for her this is simply the opening movement of something that will continue in one form or another until well after dark. I want to be honest with you about something. When I first sat with the sheer scope of what fell to women like Agnes in a single ordinary morning, it genuinely stopped me for a moment. Not because it seemed miserable, though it was genuinely hard, but because of how much quiet, unglamorous competence it required. Competence that history rarely bothered to record, because it was simply what women did, every day, without anyone thinking to write it down as remarkable. After the meal, the wooden bowls and spoons need washing, and this is one of those tasks that sounds almost too simple to mention until you consider what it actually requires in a world without running water or soap as we would recognize it. Agnes gathers the dishes and steps back outside, this time toward a shallow stone trough kept near the cottage door, filled with water she fetched earlier and left to sit. She scrubs the bowls with a handful of sand and ash, an abrasive combination that cuts through grease reasonably well, rinsing everything in the cold water before setting the pieces out on a wooden rack to dry in whatever thin sunlight has managed to break through the morning clouds. Wooden dishware like this needs particular care. Left wet too long or scrubbed too roughly, it can crack or warp, and a good set of bowls represents real value to a household that cannot simply replace them on a whim. She works quickly but carefully, and within a few minutes the small pile of dishes sits drying, and she has already moved on. The garden calls to her next, and this is a part of her work that shifts dramatically with the seasons, though something needs tending there nearly every day of the year, that the ground is not frozen solid. This particular morning, the task is modest, checking on the last of the autumn vegetables still in the ground, the hardy things that can survive a light frost, cabbages and turnips and a stubborn row of leeks that seem entirely unbothered by the cold. She pulls a few for the evening meal, brushing soil from their roots, and notices with a small frown that something, likely rabbits, has been at the edge of the cabbage row again. This is a problem for later, one she files away mentally alongside everything else, a small addition to that ever-growing internal list. Within that small plot sits an entire hidden universe of knowledge that Agnes carries with her, knowledge about which plants thrive in which soil, which need shade and which need full sun, which can be planted together and which will compete badly for the same nutrients. She knows this the way a modern person might know how to read, so completely that she rarely stops to consider how much she actually knows. Beyond the vegetables there is a smaller patch given over to herbs, some for cooking, some for medicine, and this distinction between the two is far blurrier in her world than it would be in ours. Sage for seasoning meat, but also sage steeped as a tea for a sore throat. Mint for flavour, but also mint to settle an upset stomach. Comfrey, which she keeps a careful eye on, useful for poultices when someone in the family takes a bad fall or a deep cut. Agnes is not formally trained as anything resembling a physician, and yet she is, in the most practical sense, the primary healthcare provider for her entire household, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations of women exactly like her. Not everything grown in that small plot is for immediate use. Some of it needs to be dried and stored, hung in bundles from the rafters where the smoke from the hearth fire, oddly enough, helps preserve it and keep insects away. She makes a mental note that the thyme is nearly ready for cutting and hanging, another small task to fold into the coming days. There is a particular rhythm to how the middle part of her morning unfolds, and it is worth pausing to notice it, because it does not look at all like a list of chores checked off one after another. It looks more like a kind of dance, moving from task to task based on what the moment requires, rather than any rigid schedule, responding to a fussing child, a boiling pot, a change in the weather, all while carrying that same steady, unhurried competence throughout. Alice has taken Margaret to sit near the garden's edge, half watching her, half distracted by a caterpillar she has found on a cabbage leaf, and their quiet chatter drifts across the yard, mixing with the clucking of hens and the distant sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere down the lane, probably Thomas's brother, who lives 2 cottages over and always seems to be working on his woodpile at this hour. Spinning is next, or rather, spinning slots itself into whatever gaps in the morning present themselves, because unlike baking or milking, it does not demand a particular hour. Agnes keeps a drop spindle near her usual seat by the fire, and whenever her hands are free even for a few minutes, whenever she is minding the pottage or simply sitting to nurse Edmund again, she will pick it up and let the wool run through her fingers, twisting it into thread with a motion so practiced it requires almost no conscious thought at all. This is another one of those skills that modern audiences sometimes find themselves genuinely fascinated by once they understand how it actually worked. The spindle drops, spinning steadily under its own weight, and Agnes feeds raw wool into the twist with her fingers, drawing it out into an even thread that winds itself gradually around the spindle's shaft. It looks almost like a magic trick the first time you see it done well. It is not magic. It is thousands of hours of practice, most of it accumulated since she was a girl no older than Alice, sitting beside her own mother, learning the exact same motion. A knock at the door frame, more of a call from outside really, interrupts the quiet rhythm. It is Cecily's daughter, a girl of perhaps 14 named Joan, sent to ask whether Agnes might come help with the washing later, since several households have agreed to share the labour of laundering wool blankets today, a task heavy enough and water-intensive enough that doing it alone would take most of a day, while several women working together can finish it by early afternoon. Agnes agrees readily. This kind of cooperative labour is woven so thoroughly into village life that it barely registers as a special arrangement. It is simply how certain tasks get done, particularly the ones too large or too physically demanding for a single household to manage efficiently on its own. There is no formal system behind this, no schedule kept anywhere, just a kind of shared understanding among the women of the village about which tasks call for cooperation and whose turn it is to organise them. This detail matters more than it might first appear. Peasant women in this world were not isolated figures labouring alone within the 4 walls of their own cottages, cut off from each other the way modern suburban life can sometimes make households feel isolated from their neighbours. Agnes's days are threaded through with these small moments of connection, at the stream, at the coop, at each other's gardens, brief exchanges that carry real information and real support, a kind of informal network that functioned as both social life and mutual aid rolled into one. When someone falls ill, this network is what brings a pot of pottage to their door. When a birth is imminent, this network is what sends for the local midwife and gathers to help however is needed. Agnes belongs to this web as completely as she belongs to her own family, and in some ways it asks just as much of her. Today happens to fall a few days before the village's regular market day, and this too shapes the shrinking pool of time Agnes has for anything resembling rest. There is a modest surplus this month, a portion of wool that has been spun and will be sold or traded, along with a basket of eggs beyond what the family needs, and a small quantity of dried herbs that a neighbouring household has expressed interest in trading for. None of this is glamorous work, exactly, but it represents one of the only ways a household like this generates anything resembling disposable resources, coin or goods traded for coin, that might go towards something the family cannot produce for themselves. A length of cloth they cannot weave as well as they can buy, a tool that needs replacing, perhaps, if the year has been generous, a small treat for the children, a bit of honey or dried fruit brought in from further afield. Agnes begins sorting through what will go to market, checking the spun wool for evenness and strength, setting aside the finer thread from the coarser, because buyers will pay differently depending on quality, and she has learnt over years of trading exactly what a fair price looks like and exactly how far she can push it before a deal falls apart. This kind of practical economic literacy rarely gets attributed to medieval peasant women in the popular imagination, and yet here it sits, quietly, as just another one of the many forms of competence she carries without particular fanfare. The day carries its own religious rhythm too, threaded through everything else without ever quite becoming a separate category of activity. It is not a saint's day today, nothing that would call for a break from ordinary labour or a special observance, but even so, Agnes crosses herself briefly before she begins the sorting, a small automatic gesture, the kind of thing done so many times it has become almost involuntary, like breathing. Later, at some point in the day, there will be a moment of prayer, likely brief, likely spoken while her hands are still busy with something else entirely, because faith in this world is rarely something set apart from labour. It exists inside labour, alongside it, informing the small daily choices about honesty and trade and generosity toward neighbours in need, without requiring a separate block of time carved out to express itself. Stay with me here for a moment, because there is something worth sitting with in how naturally all of this fits together. The prayer and the wool sorting and the neighbour's request for help with the laundry are not separate compartments of her day competing for attention. They flow into each other, one leading naturally to the next, and this seamlessness is perhaps one of the most striking differences between Agnes's world and our own, where we have become so accustomed to dividing our time into labelled categories: work, faith, family, rest, each cordoned off from the others. For her it is all simply life, happening continuously, one long unbroken thread not unlike the wool running through her fingers on the spindle. By mid-morning, Agnes makes her way toward the stream again, this time with a bundle of wool blankets tucked under one arm, and Margaret trailing behind her, since Alice has been given the more solitary task of minding the fire and keeping an eye on the stew left simmering for later. The stream at this hour looks different than it did before dawn. The light has strengthened, silver and thin, filtering through bare branches that will not see leaves again for another few months, and the water itself seems to carry more sound now, a low constant murmur over the stones that Agnes has heard so many thousands of times she likely does not register it as sound at all anymore, more like silence with texture. Several women are already gathered at a wider, shallower stretch of the bank favoured for exactly this kind of work, and there is a particular quality to how they move together, without much need for direction, each falling into a role shaped by long habit. Cecily has brought a large flat stone she uses for beating dirt loose from heavier fabric. Another woman, younger than Agnes, newly married and still learning the finer points of this particular core, watches closely and mimics the movements of the others. The blankets are heavy, even dry, and soaked through with cold stream water they become genuinely difficult to manage, requiring real strength to wring and beat and rinse properly. The work is loud in its own quiet way, punctuated by the slap of wet wool against stone, by low conversation that rises and falls, by Margaret and two other small children playing some invented game along the bank, under only partial supervision, the kind of loose collective watchfulness that comes naturally when several mothers are gathered in the same place at once. Nobody needs to formally assign who is watching which child. It simply happens, an unspoken agreement renewed every single time women like this gather to work. There is laughter here too, and this matters, because it would be easy to imagine a life this demanding as one drained entirely of joy, and that would be wrong. Cecily tells a story about her husband's failed attempt at repairing their roof last week that has the whole group of women laughing, Agnes included, her hands never quite stopping their work even as she laughs, wringing water from a blanket with practiced twists of her forearms. There is real pleasure in this morning, genuine warmth between these women, even as the water numbs their hands and the wool grows heavier with each rinse. By the time the blankets are wrung out and laid over branches and low fences to dry in whatever sun the day offers, well over an hour has passed, and Agnes's hands are red and aching from the cold, but the work is done, shared among 5 households instead of borne alone by one, and there is something quietly remarkable in that arrangement when you sit with it for a moment. A task that would have consumed an entire day of one woman's labour leaving nothing else accomplished, has instead taken a single morning shared among friends, freeing everyone involved to move on to whatever else the day requires of them. Back at the cottage, the midday meal is approaching, and this one tends to be slightly heartier than breakfast, particularly on a day when Thomas has been out in the field since early morning, and will need real sustenance to carry him through the afternoon's labour. Agnes checks the pottage Alice has been minding, adds the vegetables pulled from the garden earlier, and sets about preparing whatever else the household can spare. There might be a bit of cheese today, made some weeks earlier and aged in a cool corner of the cottage, or perhaps a modest portion of salted bacon, sliced thin to stretch further across the whole family. Bread from this morning's baking, now fully cooled, is cut into portions, and this simple assembly of pottage, bread, and perhaps cheese represents the bulk of what an ordinary peasant family ate on an ordinary day, filling and practical rather than varied or particularly exciting, though seasoned well enough with the herbs from Agnes's garden that it is far from bland. Thomas returns from the fields for this meal, mud on his boots and a weariness in his shoulders that speaks to a morning of genuinely hard physical labour, and the family gathers again briefly, this pause in the day slightly longer than breakfast had been, but still not what anyone would call leisurely. There is talk of the afternoon ahead, Thomas mentioning that he will need to return to the fields for several more hours yet, the light this time of year being precious and not to be wasted, and Will, having apparently negotiated successfully at some point during the morning, is permitted to accompany his father this time, given a smaller, lighter task suited to an 11-year-old's strength, gathering stones cleared from the soil and piling them at the field's edge. With the men and Will gone back out to the fields, the afternoon settles into a different, quieter register, and this is where I want to slow down with you a little, because the pace of the day itself is beginning to shift, and it feels right that we shift with it. Agnes gathers Margaret and Alice close to the hearth, and the three of them settle into work that can be done sitting, work that does not require the same physical exertion as the morning's tasks, but demands instead a different kind of patience, a fine, careful attentiveness. There is mending to do. There is almost always mending to do in a household like this, because clothing is expensive to replace and cheap, relatively speaking, to repair, and Agnes has raised her daughters to understand from an early age that a torn seam caught quickly is a far smaller problem than one left to fray further. She works on a tear in one of Thomas's shirts, the fabric worn thin at the elbow from years of labour, and beside her Alice practices her own stitches on a scrap of cloth, her tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration, the universal expression of a child trying very hard to do something correctly. Margaret, too young yet for a needle, contents herself with winding loose thread around a small wooden spool, a task invented largely to keep her occupied and feeling useful rather than out of any real necessity. This quiet domestic scene carries within it an entire education happening almost invisibly. Alice is not attending any kind of formal school, will likely never attend one, and yet she is being trained, hour by patient hour, in skills that will determine the well-being of her own future household one day. Sewing, mending, eventually spinning and perhaps weaving if her family's circumstances allow for a loom, which not every household possesses, looms being a somewhat larger investment than a simple drop spindle. Some households in the village do keep a loom, a large wooden frame strung with warp threads, and weaving on it is slow, exacting work, requiring the weaver to pass the shuttle back and forth by hand, building the cloth up thread by thread, row by row, a process that can take many days to produce even a modest length of linen or wool cloth. Agnes's family does not own one, relying instead on trade with a neighbour who does, exchanging spun thread and occasional labour for finished cloth when the need arises. The fire needs feeding now, and Agnes rises to add another length of wood, watching the flames catch and settle before returning to her seat. There is a comfort in this room right now that is worth naming, even though nobody inside it would think to name it themselves. The light is low and warm, filtered through smoke that has, over years, stained the wattle and daub walls a soft, smoky grey near the ceiling. The smell is a mixture of things layered atop each other, wood smoke, the lingering warmth of this morning's baked bread, the faint animal must of wool drying near the fire, and underneath it all, something green and slightly herbal from the bundles of drying plants hanging from the low rafters. Outside, the afternoon carries on with its particular sounds. A dog somewhere further down the lane, the distant creak of a cartwheel, birds that have grown bold enough in the relative daytime warmth to argue loudly among the bare branches of a nearby tree. Agnes's thoughts, while her hands continue their steady work with the needle, drift toward the coming weeks, and this is where the season itself begins to assert its presence over the shape of her days. It is autumn, edging toward winter, and this particular stretch of the calendar carries its own distinct demands, entirely different from what spring or summer would ask of her. This is preservation season, the weeks when the harvest, such as it was this year, needs to be transformed into something that will survive the cold months ahead without spoiling. She thinks through what remains to be done. There are apples still to be dried, sliced thin and laid out on woven trays near the hearth's edge where the gentle warmth will slowly draw the moisture from them over several days. There are herbs still hanging that need checking, turned occasionally so they dry evenly and do not mould in the damp autumn air. There is a modest store of cabbages that need to be packed properly into the small root cellar dug beneath one corner of the cottage, along with turnips and onions, arranged carefully so that rot in one does not spread quickly to its neighbours, a lesson learned the hard way some years back when carelessness cost the family a good portion of their winter stores. After the mending, she turns to check on the apples already drying, turning several slices that have curled and darkened nicely at the edges, their sweetness concentrating as the moisture leaves them behind. Preserving food in this world is not a single skill but a whole collection of related ones, each suited to a different kind of food and a different kind of spoilage it needs protecting against. Meat gets salted, sometimes smoked over the hearth fire, the salt drawing out moisture and creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that would otherwise cause it to rot within days. Vegetables that store well on their own, like the cabbages and turnips, simply need cool, dark, properly ventilated conditions, which the root cellar provides, though it requires regular checking throughout the winter to catch any spoilage before it spreads. Fruits get dried, as the apples are being dried now, or occasionally preserved in honey when the household has enough to spare, honey being valuable enough that it is not used carelessly. There is a kind of quiet mathematics running constantly beneath all of this, an ongoing calculation Agnes performs almost without noticing she is performing it. How much grain remains, measured against how many mouths need feeding, and how many weeks remain until spring planting might yield something new. How much salted meat the pig slaughtered last year, plus whatever additional meat Thomas might bring home from an occasional successful hunt, will need to stretch across the coming months. This calculation carries real weight, because a miscalculation, a winter that runs longer than expected, or a store that spoils faster than planned for, does not simply mean an inconvenience. It can mean genuine hunger before spring arrives. Agnes carries this awareness lightly, most days, having done this calculation enough times across enough years to trust her own instincts, but it never entirely leaves her. The afternoon light has begun to shift, taking on that particular amber quality that arrives an hour or two before proper sunset, and Agnes realizes the firewood supply near the hearth has grown thin, dwindled down by the steady demands of the day's cooking and the fire's constant need for feeding. This sends her, along with Alice now old enough to help meaningfully with this particular task, out toward the small wooded area at the edge of the village where fallen branches and deadwood can be gathered freely, the standing trees themselves generally protected under rules governing what belongs to the Lord's forest and what may be freely taken by villagers. Gathering wood is not glamorous work, and it does not photograph well, so to speak, in the way that milking a cow at sunrise might, but it is essential in a way that is easy to underestimate. Every single fire that will burn in that cottage, for warmth, for cooking, for light in the darkening evening hours, depends on this steady, unglamorous labour of collecting and hauling wood. Agnes and Alice work together, gathering dry branches into a canvas sling Agnes carries for exactly this purpose, and the work has its own rhythm, bend and gather, punctuated by Alice's occasional questions about which wood burns best, a question Agnes answers patiently, explaining that the dry ash and oak burn slow and steady, good for a fire meant to last through the night, while the thinner, quicker burning wood suits the fire that needs to catch fast for immediate cooking. There is something worth noticing in how naturally this becomes a lesson without ever announcing itself as one. Elise is not being taught in any formal sense. She is simply present, working alongside her mother, absorbing knowledge the way children absorb almost everything important in a world without schools built for this kind of practical instruction. By the time she has children of her own, assuming she survives to have them, all of this will live in her hands and her instincts as completely as it lives in Agnes's now, passed forward without ever needing to be written down. They return to the cottage with the sling full, arms tired, cheeks reddened by the cold afternoon air, and there is still the question of light for the evening hours ahead. Firelight alone does not always provide enough illumination for finer work, sewing especially, and so households like Agnes's often rely on candles or, more commonly among peasant families who cannot always afford proper beeswax, on rushlights, a simpler and cheaper alternative made by soaking the pith of rushes, a common marsh plant, in animal fat rendered and saved from cooking. Agnes has a small store of rendered fat set aside for exactly this purpose, and this evening, with a little extra time before the true business of preparing supper begins, she dips a bundle of dried rushes through the warm fat, coating them evenly, then sets them aside on a flat stone to cool and harden. The light outside is fading now, sliding from that amber afternoon glow into something cooler, greyer, the long shadows of early evening stretching across the yard and the bare garden rows. This is the hour when the whole village seems to exhale collectively, the day's heaviest labour drawing to a close, even as the day's work, for someone like Agnes, continues without any real interruption. She sets the rushlights aside to finish hardening and turns her attention to supper, which needs to be more substantial than the midday meal, since it will need to carry the family through until morning. She checks the pot still simmering over the fire, adds what remains of the vegetables pulled earlier, along with a generous portion of the salted bacon set aside for exactly this purpose, letting it all cook down together into something thick and warming. The smell that begins to fill the cottage now is different from this morning's smell of fresh bread, richer, meatier, mingling with wood smoke in a way that Agnes has likely stopped consciously noticing decades ago, but which would strike a modern visitor immediately, walking in from the cold evening air into this warm, fragrant room, small as it was. Outside, she can hear the particular sounds that mark this hour across the whole village, sounds she has grown so used to that they register more as texture than as individual noises worth naming. A cart creaking somewhere down the lane, probably a neighbour bringing in the last load of something from the fields before full dark, voices calling children in from wherever they have wandered during the day's remaining light, the lowing of cattle being brought back to their shelters for the night. Somewhere further off, the church bell marking the hour, a sound that structures the entire village's sense of time in a way that has nothing to do with the mechanical clocks that would not become common for centuries yet. Thomas and Will return as the light drops toward true dusk, both of them tired in the particular way that comes from a full day of physical labour, mud caked on their boots and their hands, and there is a brief flurry of activity as boots come off at the door, as Thomas checks briefly on the animals one last time before the household settles fully indoors for the night. Will recounts, with the particular breathless enthusiasm of a boy who has spent his day feeling useful alongside his father, some small drama from the fields, a fox spotted at the tree line, a stone so large it took both of them to move it. Agnes listens with half her attention while the other half remains on the pot, on Margaret, who has grown fussy with the approach of evening tiredness, on the general choreography of getting everyone settled and fed before full darkness makes everything harder. There is something worth sitting with in this particular hour, this transition from day into evening, because it carries a quality that feels almost universal across centuries, a shift in energy that anyone who has ever come home tired at the end of a long day might recognize, even separated from Agnes by 700 years and an entire world of circumstance. The specific tasks are utterly foreign to us. The feeling underneath them, the settling, the gathering in, the small relief of having made it through another day's demands, That part translates without needing any translation at all. Supper is served in the deepening dark, the cottage now lit primarily by the fire itself, its orange light dancing across the walls and across the faces of the family gathered close around it. The rushlights Agnes prepared earlier sit ready but unlit for now, saved for later, for finer work that will need more direct illumination than the fire alone provides. The pottage tonight is thick and rich with the bacon and vegetables, and there is still bread from the morning's baking. And the family eats with the particular unhurried satisfaction that comes after a genuinely demanding day, when food is not simply fuel but something closer to reward. Conversation here carries a different quality than it did at breakfast, slower, less clipped by the urgency of tasks waiting to be started. Thomas describes the state of the field in more detail now that the day's work on it is finished, mentions that the ground held up better than he had feared given the recent frost, and there is a note of quiet satisfaction in how he says it, the particular pride of a man who has spent his whole life reading soil and weather and knowing, with real confidence, what a piece of land is likely to do. Will, full of supper and the day's exertion, grows quieter, his earlier enthusiasm settling into a heavy-eyed contentment. Alice asks a question about the caterpillar she found earlier, wondering aloud whether it will become a butterfly before the cold kills it, and Agnes answers honestly that she is not certain, that the cold usually comes too fast for that, and there is a small note of genuine sadness in Alice's face at this news that Agnes gently talks her through, the way any mother might soften a small disappointment for a child who has not yet learned that not every story ends the way you might hope. Margaret, worn out from the day, has grown quiet and heavy against her mother's side, and at some point during the meal she simply stops eating and leans fully into Agnes, half asleep already, and Agnes shifts to accommodate her without any real interruption to the conversation, the movement so practiced it barely registers as a movement at all. This is one of those small physical intimacies that fills so much of Agnes's day without ever being named as such, the constant low-level awareness of where each child is and what each child needs, carried in her body almost the way she might carry the rhythm of her own breathing, present at every moment without requiring conscious thought. After the meal, the dishes need washing again, though this time it is a smaller task, done quickly by firelight with water that has been kept warm near the hearth. Thomas, meanwhile, has moved to check over a tool that broke slightly during the day's work, a wooden handle that is cracked and needs either repair or replacement before tomorrow, and there is a low, companionable quiet that settles over the cottage now, each member of the family occupied with some small closing task of the day, none of it urgent in the way the morning's tasks were urgent, all of it simply the necessary business of preparing for tomorrow, while today still has a little light left to give. Agnes lights one of the rushlights now, its flames smaller and less steady than a proper candle would provide, but enough to work by, and settles back into her mending from earlier, returning to the tear in Thomas's shirt that she set aside hours before. This is, I think, one of the quieter and more genuinely peaceful stretches of her entire day, this hour after supper, when the most demanding physical labour has concluded, and what remains is simply small, steady handwork done in the glow of firelight, while her family settles around her. Her hands move through the familiar motion of the needle, and her mind finally has room to wander somewhere other than the next task waiting to be done. Her thoughts, unhurried now, drift toward the shape of the year as a whole, the way the seasons carry entirely different demands, entirely different rhythms, so that the Agnes of late autumn, mending by rushlight with preservation on her mind, feels almost like a different person than the Agnes of high summer or the depths of winter. This is worth slowing down to consider, because it is easy, hearing about a single day, to imagine that day repeating itself identically across the whole calendar, and nothing could be further from the truth. Spring arrives with its own particular urgency, one built around planting and around new life in every sense of the phrase. The fields need preparing, seed needs sowing at exactly the right moment, not too early when a late frost might kill tender shoots, not too late to miss the growing season's full benefit. Agnes's garden work intensifies dramatically in these weeks, turning soil, planting the vegetables that will need to carry the household through the coming months. And spring, more than any other season, tends to bring new animal life into the household's care. Lambs, sometimes, If the family keeps sheep, which they have in years past, though not this particular year, chicks hatching, the occasional calf, there is a tenderness to this season that Agnes genuinely loves, watching new life establish itself after the long grey stretch of winter, even as the workload itself grows heavier by the week. Summer brings its own distinct character, longer days that stretch the available working hours considerably, which sounds like a relief until you consider that it simply means more hours available for labour, rather than fewer hours of labour required. The hay needs cutting and drying at precisely the right moment, a task that depends entirely on weather cooperating and that pulls nearly every able-bodied person in the village into the fields for several intense days when the time comes, Agnes included, her usual domestic tasks compressed and rushed to make room for this larger seasonal demand. The garden, by midsummer, is producing steadily, and much of Agnes's energy shifts toward managing that abundance, picking and using what ripens each day before it spoils, beginning the early stages of what will become the serious preservation work of early autumn. And then there is winter, which stands in such stark contrast to the other seasons that it hardly seems to belong to the same year at all. The days shrink down to almost nothing, darkness arriving by mid-afternoon, and not lifting again until well into what would still feel like morning by summer's standard. The fields lie fallow, Thomas's outdoor labour reduced dramatically, though never eliminated entirely, since there is always wood to cut, always tools to mend, always the animals' shelter to maintain against the worst of the cold. For Agnes, winter shifts the balance of her labour indoors almost entirely, toward the steady, patient work of spinning and weaving and mending that can be done by firelight through the long dark hours, toward careful management of the stores she worked so hard to preserve through autumn, stretching them with real discipline to make certain they last until spring actually arrives, and not simply until the calendar suggests it should. Winter is also, if she is honest with herself, the season she finds hardest, not because the physical labour is heavier, since in some ways it is lighter than the demands of summer, but because of the cold itself, a cold that settles into the cottage no matter how carefully the fire is tended, a cold that makes every trip outside to the animals or the woodpile feel like a small battle. It is also, she thinks, watching Margaret's small chest rise and fall in sleep against her side, the season she worries most about because it is winter that tends to claim the youngest and the oldest when illness comes calling, winter that turned her own firstborn daughter's brief illness into something the family's herbs and prayers could not overcome. She does not dwell on this thought long. She has learned, over years, not to dwell on it, though it never entirely leaves her either, resting somewhere quiet beneath the surface of her attention, the way a stone rests at the bottom of a stream, unseen but never quite gone. There is a particular resilience in how she holds all of this, the joy of spring and the intensity of summer and the quiet danger of winter, without letting any single season's character define her entirely. She has learnt to move with the year rather than against it, to expect its demands rather than resent them, and there is something in that acceptance that I find myself genuinely admiring, a kind of hard-won wisdom that no amount of comfort or convenience could really teach. Will has grown properly sleepy now too, though he would never admit it outright, propping his head against his hand at the table in a way that keeps sliding further down no matter how he adjusts it. And this is the hour, most nights, when someone in the family offers a story, a habit so old in this household that nobody could quite say when it started, only that it has always been there, as much a part of the evening as the fire itself. Tonight it is Thomas who begins, setting aside the tool he has been repairing, and he tells a story he has told many times before, about his own grandfather and a particularly stubborn goat that once got loose during a village feast day and caused what Thomas always describes, with a small smile that suggests the story has grown taller with each retelling, as an afternoon of genuine chaos. The children know this story. They have heard it more times than they could count, and yet they lean in anyway, because the pleasure of it is not really in the surprise. There is none left, but in the familiar shape of it, the particular way Thomas's voice drops when the goat finally gets cornered, the way he always pauses just before describing exactly how it escaped again, letting the moment stretch a beat longer than strictly necessary. Alice mouths along with a line she has memorized without meaning to. Margaret, mostly asleep now, stirs slightly at the sound of her father's voice rising with the story's small climax, then settles again. This nightly storytelling carries more weight than its casual, almost automatic presence in the evening might suggest. In a world without books for a family like this one, without any of them able to read beyond perhaps recognizing a few words from church, without any written entertainment of any kind reaching this small cottage, story is how history moves. It is how a boy like Will comes to know his own great-grandfather, a man he never met, existing for him only through the shape of this story, told and retold, worn smooth like a stone handled too many times to count. It is how values travel too, quietly, without ever announcing themselves as lessons. The goat story is, on its surface, simply funny, but underneath it sits something about persistence, about laughing at your own mistakes rather than being crushed by them, about family continuing on despite whatever chaos any particular day might bring. Remember what we noticed earlier about how naturally the household's faith wove itself through the day without ever becoming a separate category of activity. Storytelling works the same way. It is not a formal lesson, not something anyone would think to label as education, and yet it is doing exactly that work, every single night, in this small firelit room, passing forward everything this family knows about who they are and where they came from. By the time the story finishes, Margaret is fully asleep, and Agnes lifts her carefully, carrying her behind the woven partition to the small pallet where she and her sister sleep, tucking a worn wool blanket around her small shoulders with the same careful attention she has brought to every task today. Whether that task was milking a cow or comforting a child, Alice follows shortly after, given a gentle push toward bed despite a brief and entirely predictable protest that she is not tired at all, a protest immediately undermined by an enormous yawn that makes even Alice laugh a little at herself. Will climbs back up to the loft without much prompting needed, the day's labour in the fields having done what argument alone rarely could. With the children settled, the cottage grows quieter in a way that feels almost startling after the day's constant motion, the particular hush of a house where everyone but two people has gone to sleep. Agnes returns to her seat by the fire, picking the mending back up, and Thomas sits across from her, still working at the cracked handle, and for a while neither of them speaks much, the silence comfortable rather than empty, filled instead with the small sounds of their respective work, the soft rasp of needle through cloth, the quiet scrape of a knife shaping wood. It is Thomas who eventually breaks the quiet, mentioning that market day is only a few days off now, and the conversation shifts naturally toward the practical business of what the household will bring and what it might need to bring home in exchange. Agnes mentions the wool she sorted earlier, the eggs, the herbs a neighbouring household has expressed interest in, and Thomas nods along, adding that he has heard from another villager that a travelling tinker is expected to pass through around the same time, which raises the question of whether the cooking pot, showing a thin patch near its base for months now, might finally be worth having properly repaired, rather than continuing to nurse along. There is something quietly companionable in this kind of conversation. Two people who have spent 12 years building a shared life out of exactly these small, practical negotiations, weighing needs against resources, planning several days ahead in the patient, unhurried way that people do when there is no illusion of being able to simply solve a problem by spending money they do not have. Market day itself, when it comes, will not be leisurely either, not really, though it will carry its own particular energy, different from the rhythm of an ordinary day. The whole village turns toward it in the days beforehand, goods gathered and sorted, and on the day itself there will be a walk to the larger settlement a few miles off where the market is held, a rare journey beyond the immediate boundaries of the village, filled with the low hum of dozens of small transactions and exchanges of news from villages further afield than their own. Agnes finds herself looking forward to it, if she is honest, not simply for the practical business of trading, but for the change of scenery it offers, the chance to see faces beyond the same 30 families she sees every single day of her life, to hear news of the wider world beyond what reaches this small village through the occasional traveller or returning trader. It is a small pleasure, but a real one, and she allows herself to sit with the anticipation of it for a moment before her attention returns, as it always eventually does, to whatever remains of the evening's tasks. Edmund stirs from his basket near the fire, a soft fussing sound rather than a full cry, and Agnes sets the mending aside once more to lift him, settling him against her shoulder and walking a slow, small circuit of the room, patting his back gently in the particular rhythm that experience has taught her tends to soothe him. This happens several times most nights, this rising to tend to him, and it asks something of her that daytime tasks, demanding as they are, do not quite ask in the same way. It asks for wakefulness during the hours her own body would otherwise be resting, a debt that accumulates slowly across weeks and months of a newborn's irregular sleep, paid for in a particular kind of tiredness that sits behind the eyes and does not fully lift even after a full night's rest, when a full night's rest happens to be available at all. She does not complain of this, not tonight, not most nights, though there have been harder stretches, weeks after Edmund's birth, when exhaustion pressed down on her so completely that even Thomas, not always the most naturally observant man about matters like this, noticed and began taking on more of the household's evening tasks, to give her what rest he could manage to offer. That particular kindness, quiet and practical rather than declared, is one of the things Agnes values most about the life she and Thomas have built together, this willingness to notice when the other is nearing the edge of what they can carry, and to shift the weight accordingly, without either of them needing to ask directly. Edmund settles again eventually, and Agnes returns him to his basket, tucking the wool blanket close around him before easing back into her own seat. The fire has burned down somewhat over the course of the evening, and she rises once more to add another length of wood, watching the flames catch and climb before settling back into a chair. And there is a stretch here, brief but real, where she simply sits, hands still for once, watching the fire's movement in the way people have watched fire for as long as there have been fires to watch, something almost hypnotic in the shifting orange light against the dark room. Her eyes drift toward the small shelf near the hearth where the household keeps its handful of genuinely valuable possessions, not valuable in any grand sense, but valuable to this particular family, accumulated slowly across years. A small iron cooking pot, the one Thomas mentioned needs mending, a wooden box, carved simply but carefully by Thomas's father decades ago, holding a few pieces of cloth too fine for everyday use, saved for church, for whatever rare occasion might call for something better than what they wear daily, a small clay jar of honey, used sparingly, more medicine than food most of the time, a spoonful stirred into warm water when one of the children takes ill with a cough. These are not many possessions by any modern standard, and yet each one represents real thought, real care in how the household organizes and protects what little it has, because in a world where almost nothing can simply be replaced by a trip to a shop, everything owned carries weight beyond its immediate use. On occasion, usually timed around a particular saint's feast or some special gathering, the household will make proper candles rather than relying on the simpler rushlights that serve for most ordinary evenings. This requires beeswax, which the family does not produce themselves, having no hives of their own, but which they trade for periodically from a neighbour a few villages over who does keep bees, or occasionally purchase in small quantities at market. When the occasion calls for it, Agnes melts the wax carefully over the fire in a small pot kept for that purpose, and dips a length of prepared wick again and again into the melted wax, allowing each layer to cool and harden slightly before adding the next, building the candle up gradually until it reaches a usable thickness. It is slow, careful work, requiring patience and a practiced sense of timing, since wax that is too hot will simply melt away the layers already built, and wax allowed to cool too much between dips will not adhere properly to what came before. There is no candle making planned for tonight, but Agnes finds her mind circling back to the process anyway, thinking ahead to the coming feast day when the household will want proper candlelight, rather than the dimmer, smokier glow of rushlights, another small thread in the endless weave of planning that seems to occupy some quiet corner of her attention at almost every hour of every day. This capacity for constant, low-level planning, holding dozens of small future tasks in mind while simultaneously managing whatever the present moment requires, is perhaps one of the least visible but most essential skills she carries, invisible precisely because it produces no single dramatic result, only the steady, reliable functioning of an entire household across weeks and months and years. The cottage itself, at this hour, has settled into its nighttime character, different from how it feels during the bustle of daylight hours. The single room holds its warmth close now, fire and bodies together keeping the worst of the cold at bay, and the thatched roof overhead, thick and dense, muffles whatever sounds the night outside might otherwise carry in. Wind through bare branches, the occasional distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the village's edge. The packed earth floor, swept carefully each day, has grown cool again after the day's activity, though the area immediately around the hearth remains warm enough that Agnes keeps her feet drawn up beneath her skirts rather than resting them flat against it. There was butter made just 2 days past, and Agnes's mind drifts to it now as she sits, the way thoughts tend to wander loosely once the day's demands finally slacken. She had gathered the cream that had risen slowly to the top of several days' worth of milk, skimmed carefully with a wooden spoon into a tall wooden churn, and then the real work had begun, the steady, repetitive plunging of the dasher up and down, a motion that sounds simple enough described in a single sentence, but that in practice can take the better part of an hour before the cream finally, almost suddenly, transforms into something solid, that strange threshold moment when liquid becomes butter that never stops feeling faintly like a small piece of magic, no matter how many hundreds of times you have watched it happen. Cheese follows a different, slower logic entirely. What Agnes makes at home is simple by comparison to the aged, complex cheeses that wealthier households might enjoy, closer to what we might now call a fresh curd cheese, made by warming milk gently and adding a small amount of rennet taken from the stomach lining of a calf and kept carefully for exactly this purpose, which causes the milk to separate into curds and whey. She strains the curds through a cloth, presses out the remaining liquid, and what results is a soft, mild cheese that will not keep terribly long, but that adds real richness to a family meal that would otherwise rely almost entirely on grains and vegetables. Some cheese, made in larger batches during seasons of greater milk abundance, gets pressed harder and salted more heavily, aged for weeks in the cool of the small root cellar, becoming firm enough to slice thin and stretch across many meals through the leaner winter months. There is flax to think of too, though not tonight, since the flax harvest and its long involved processing belongs properly to summer, when the plants are pulled rather than cut, then left to rot, soaked and rotted just enough in water or damp ground to loosen the fibres from the woody stem inside. Agnes remembers the smell of it vividly even now, a particular sour, vegetal smell that clings to clothing and hands for days, and the long tedious work that follows, breaking the dried stalks, scutching them against a wooden blade to separate fibre from chaff, then combing the fibres through a bed of iron teeth called hackles until what remains is a soft pale bundle ready for spinning into linen thread, a finer and more difficult thread to spin evenly than wool. This linen thread, once spun, becomes cloth only through the neighbour's loom, since her own household lacks one, and Agnes trades her labour and a portion of her spun thread for a length of finished linen each year, enough for undergarments and other pieces where linen serves better than wool, being cooler against the skin and easier to wash clean. She thinks too of Sunday, still a few days off, when the whole family will walk together to the small stone church that serves this village and several neighbouring ones, a building far grander than anything else in the immediate landscape, its modest bell tower visible from a good distance across the flat winter fields. Mass on Sunday is not simply a religious observance in the narrow sense we might imagine it now. It is one of the only regular occasions when the entire village gathers together in one place at one time, and it carries a social weight nearly equal to its spiritual one, a chance to exchange news, to notice who has fallen ill, to see whose family has grown or shrunk since the last gathering. The saints' days, scattered throughout the calendar, carry their own smaller observances too, some marked with genuine rest from labour, which the church itself mandates, and which even the local lord generally respects, offering something like the closest thing to a proper holiday that a household like Agnes's ever experiences. There is a quiet comfort in thinking through all of this whole intricate structure of days and seasons and obligations that shapes her entire life, and there is no resentment in how she holds it, not tonight, sitting warm by the fire with her family settled around her. It is simply the shape of things, as natural to her as breathing, and if a stranger from some distant future was somehow able to ask her whether she found it difficult, she might genuinely struggle to answer, because difficulty implies some alternative she can imagine, some easier way of living she is being denied, and this life is not that to her. It is simply life, the only one she has ever known, lived as fully and as competently as she knows how. There is another layer to this life worth mentioning, one that shapes nearly everything else even when it does not announce itself directly in the day's individual tasks, and that is the simple fact that neither Agnes nor Thomas owns the land they work. It belongs, in the legal and practical sense that matters most in this world, to the local lord, whose manor house sits some distance from the village, grander by far than anything in it, and Thomas's labour on that land, along with a portion of whatever the land produces, is owed to that lord as a condition of the family's right to farm their own strips and to live in this cottage at all. This arrangement, which historians would later come to describe under the broad term feudalism, is simply the unquestioned structure of the world as Agnes and Thomas understand it, no more open to debate than the changing of the seasons. Several days each month, depending on the season and the particular terms of this manor's customs, Thomas owes labour directly on the lord's own fields, work that takes him away from tending the family's own strips precisely during weeks when that time is often most needed. There are also certain dues owed at particular points in the year, a portion of grain, sometimes a portion of eggs or other produce, handed over as part of the arrangement that allows this family to hold their land at all. Agnes feels the weight of this indirectly rather than directly, in the careful calculations she performs about how much the household can truly spare toward market trade once the lord's due has been set aside, in the quiet frustration, rarely spoken aloud, when a particularly demanding stretch of labour on the lord's fields pulls Thomas away just as their own crops most need attention. And yet this system, unequal and often genuinely difficult as it could be, also came bundled with obligations flowing the other direction, obligations the Lord himself was bound to honour, at least in principle, though the reality of any particular lord's fairness varied considerably. Protection, in the most literal sense, from raiding or violence beyond what the village could defend on its own, access to the lord's mill, however costly its fee, the use of certain common lands for grazing animals that no single family could otherwise afford to maintain grazing rights over alone. It was not, in Agnes's understanding of it, a relationship built purely on exploitation, though modern eyes looking back might reasonably see it that way, given how heavily the balance tipped toward the Lord's benefit. It was simply the framework within which her entire life, her entire village's life, took shape, as unquestioned and structural as gravity. She thinks briefly of old Watt, a man some years older than Thomas who lives at the edge of the village and who fell seriously ill some weeks back, a fever that would not break for days, and how the whole village had quietly organised itself around his family's need during that stretch, women bringing food, men covering some portion of the labour his own strips required, so the crop would not be lost entirely to his illness. Agnes herself had gone to sit with his wife one afternoon, bringing what herbs she thought might help ease the fever, willow bark steeped into a bitter tea, known to bring some relief, along with simple company, since there is a particular kind of fear that comes with watching someone you love struggle against an illness, with no doctor for miles, and no certainty at all about which way it will turn. Watt recovered, in the end, slowly, and the village's collective effort during those weeks asked something real of everyone involved, time and food and labour that nobody had in true abundance to spare, and yet it was given anyway, without much discussion, because this is simply what the community did for its own. This, too, is part of what holds a village like this together across generations, this constant, largely unspoken web of mutual obligation that runs alongside and sometimes against the more formal obligations owed to the Lord. Nobody keeps a ledger of favours given and owed, not in any literal sense, and yet everyone understands, at some deep instinctive level, that today's help offered to Watt's family is tomorrow's help that might be needed by Agnes's own household, should illness or misfortune ever come calling at her own door instead. Agnes glances toward the small window opening, shuttered now against the night's cold, its wooden shutter closed tight over what during the day is simply an unglazed gap in the wall, covered sometimes with a stretched, oiled cloth, that lets in some measure of light while keeping out the worst of the weather, glass being a luxury far beyond what a household like this could ever hope to afford. She cannot see the sky through it now, but she does not need to, having read the signs earlier in the day well enough to trust her own sense of what tomorrow will likely bring. The particular reddish quality of this evening's sunset, glimpsed briefly while she gathered the last of the firewood, suggests fair weather ahead, an old piece of knowledge passed down through more generations than anyone could count. Red sky at night bringing some measure of confidence that tomorrow will not bring rain to interfere with whatever work the day requires. This kind of knowledge runs deep and wide through everything Agnes does, a whole body of accumulated observation about wind and cloud and the behaviour of animals that functions, in the absence of anything resembling a modern forecast, as the household's primary tool for planning ahead. She has learnt to watch how the swallows fly, low and frantic before a storm, high and easy when fair weather holds. She has learned that the smoke from her own hearth, when it struggles to rise properly and instead hangs low and reluctant in the room, often means a change in the weather is coming, some shift in the pressure of the air that she could not explain in those terms, but has learnt to trust from decades of observation nonetheless. None of this is superstition exactly, though it sits alongside genuine folk beliefs that blur the line between practical observation and something closer to charm or ritual, a pinch of salt thrown over the shoulder if it spills, certain tasks avoided on certain days, considered unlucky, for reasons nobody quite remembers the origin of anymore, simply inherited alongside everything else. Margaret's small wooden doll, carved simply by Thomas some years back, and dressed in a scrap of worn cloth, sits now on the bench where she left it before being carried off to bed, and Agnes's eye catches on it for a moment, a small, humble object that nonetheless represents real hours of a father's careful attention, whittled slowly over several evenings during a winter not unlike the one now approaching. Children in this household do not want for entertainment exactly, though what entertains them looks nothing like what a modern child would recognise. Margaret and her doll, Alice with a set of smooth round stones she has collected and sorted by size and colour, used in some elaborate invented game whose rules seem to shift by the week according to her own private logic. Will, old enough now that play has begun giving way steadily to real responsibility, still finds moments to carve small figures of his own from scraps of wood, animals mostly, occasionally attempting something ambitious like a small cart with wheels that actually turn, with mixed but improving success. There had been a harvest gathering not many weeks past, the whole village drawing together once the last of the grain had been safely brought in. A genuine celebration threaded through with real relief, since a poor harvest in this world does not simply mean disappointment, but potential hunger before the next one arrives. Agnes remembers it now with a small private warmth. The trestle tables set up outside, despite the growing chill, the modest but genuine abundance of that particular evening's shared meal, contributions gathered from every household according to what each could spare, and there had been music, simple instruments, a pipe and a small drum, and dancing that Agnes had joined for a while even with Edmund not yet born but heavy inside her, and Thomas's hand at her back steadying her through steps she only half remembered from her own girlhood. These moments do not come often, this village's calendar not being especially generous with occasions for pure celebration, but they exist, scattered through the year like small bright stones set into otherwise steady, unremarkable ground. And Agnes holds the memory of that evening gently now, one of the quiet private treasures she carries alongside everything else. Thomas has finished with the tool handle now, setting it aside to be properly fitted tomorrow, and he looks over at Agnes across the low firelight with the particular quiet ease of two people who have spent so many years beside each other that entire conversations sometimes happen without either of them saying very much at all. He asks, mildly, whether her hands are paining her, having noticed, without her mentioning it, the slight stiffness with which she has been working the needle tonight, a lingering ache from the cold stream water this morning. She admits that they are, a little, and he reaches over without much ceremony and takes one of her hands in both of his, rubbing some warmth back into it with the same steady, practical care he might bring to any other task. And there is nothing dramatic in this gesture, nothing that either of them would think to call romantic in any grand sense, and yet it carries real tenderness within its simplicity. Their marriage was not, by the standards this world generally operated under, a love match in the way later centuries might romanticize the idea. It was arranged, as most marriages among people of their station were, a sensible pairing of two families with adjoining land and complementary needs, decided upon by parents on both sides when Agnes was barely 18. And yet something real grew in the years since, something neither of them would have predicted on their wedding day. A partnership built slowly out of shared labor and shared hardship and shared small joys, the kind of love that does not announce itself with grand gestures because it does not need to, proven instead in 1,000 small daily acts, a hand warmed against the cold, a burden noticed and quietly shared, a story told for the 100th time because the children still love to hear it. I find something worth pausing on here, in how thoroughly this kind of partnership gets erased from so much of how we imagine the past. It is easy to picture medieval marriage as purely transactional, cold, structured entirely around property and survival, with no room left over for genuine affection. And there is truth in the transactional origins of many such marriages, Agnes and Thomas's included. But origin is not the same as outcome. Whatever brought these two people together, what exists between them now, 12 years and 4 living children later, is something that any modern couple might recognize as real love, patient and unglamorous and utterly dependable, the kind that shows up every single day, rather than announcing itself once with fanfare and then fading. The fire has burned down again, lower now than it has been all evening, and this, finally, signals the true approach of the night's end. Agnes sets aside her mending for the last time tonight, folding it carefully and setting it on the shelf where it will wait for tomorrow's stretch of free time, however much or little that turns out to be. There is one more task remaining before sleep can properly claim this household, the same task that opened her day so many hours ago, though performed now in reverse, a kind of mirror image closing the circle her whole day has traced. She kneels once more at the hearth, much as she did in the darkness before dawn, though the fire she tends now is winding down rather than being coaxed to life. This is a different skill from the morning's task, requiring its own particular patience. The goal is not to extinguish the fire, not really, but to slow it, to bank it in a way that will let the embers survive quietly through the long hours of the night without consuming the household's limited store of wood, ready to be woken again come morning by hands that already know exactly how. Working with the same bent iron tool she used hours ago, she rakes the glowing coals into a compact pile near the center of the hearth, and then, carefully, she covers them with a thick layer of ash, not so much that the fire smothers entirely, but enough that it will smolder slow and low, breathing just barely, through the cold hours ahead. This particular skill, judging exactly how much ash to use, exactly how tightly to bank the coals, is one she has refined across years of small failures and adjustments, the mornings when she uncovered a dead fire and had to start entirely fresh with flint and steel, cursing quietly under her breath at the lost time, teaching her, gradually, exactly how to avoid that outcome. Tonight she gets it right, as she nearly always does now, and the fire settles into its low, patient sleep, a faint warmth still radiating from beneath its ashen blanket. Thomas has already moved behind the partition, and Agnes takes one last slow circuit of the room before following him, checking that the door is properly secured against the night and whatever small dangers it might carry. A fox after the chickens, perhaps, nothing more dramatic than that most nights, though the habit of checking runs deeper than any specific fear, simply another small act of care performed so many times it no longer requires conscious thought. She glances toward the loft where Will sleeps, his breathing slow and even, and behind the partition where Alice and Margaret lie, curled together beneath their shared blanket, and finally toward Edmund's basket, which she lifts now and carries with her to set beside the bed she shares with Thomas, close enough that his first stirring cry in the night hours will reach her instantly. There is a particular quality to this last quiet circuit of the room each night that I think carries real weight, even though nothing dramatic happens during it. It is Agnes taking a final accounting of her whole world, gathered here within these 4 walls, checking that everyone she loves is safe and warm and accounted for before she allows herself to finally, fully rest. She does this every single night, has done it for years, will likely do it for years still to come, and there is something in that steady, quiet vigilance that deserves to be noticed, even though nobody in the family would ever think to name it as anything remarkable. It is simply what a mother does, at the close of a day that asks nearly everything of her, one final act of care before her own needs are finally allowed to matter. She lies down at last beside Thomas, who is already settled into something close to sleep, his breathing slow and heavy in the way of a man who has spent an entire day doing hard physical work beneath an open sky. The bed itself is simple, a wooden frame strung with rope to support a mattress stuffed with straw, refreshed periodically through the year as the old straw grows flat and stale, topped with a woolen blanket and, on the coldest nights, a second blanket layered over that, along with whatever spare cloth the household can spare toward warmth. It is not soft in any way a modern body would recognize as soft, and yet Agnes's body has long since adjusted to it, finding in its particular firmness something closer to comfort than complaint. The darkness in the room now is nearly complete, broken only by the faintest orange glow leaking from beneath the banked ash at the hearth, so dim it barely qualifies as light at all, more a suggestion of warmth than anything the eye can properly use. Agnes lies still, listening to the small sounds of her sleeping household settling around her. Thomas is breathing beside her, the soft rustle of Margaret shifting in her sleep behind the partition, Edmund's own small breaths from the basket close at hand, steady and even for now, though she knows from experience that this steadiness may not last the full night through. Outside, the village has gone properly quiet. The particular hush of a place with no artificial light to keep it awake past what the natural day allows, no glow of screens or street lamps to blur the line between day and night the way a modern town might. There is only the dark, deep and total, broken occasionally by whatever moon happens to be riding the sky that particular night, and the cold, and the small persistent sounds of a world that does not entirely sleep, even when its human residents do. An owl somewhere distant, the faint stir of wind through branches gone bare for the season. Agnes feels the particular ache that settles into a body after a day like this one, a tiredness located not in any single place but spread evenly through her shoulders and her lower back and the soles of her feet, the accumulated cost of hours spent kneeling and carrying and bending and reaching. It is not an unpleasant tiredness, not tonight, not most nights, but rather the honest physical residue of a day well spent, work well done, a household properly tended. She finds herself, in these last waking moments before sleep finally claims her, running back briefly over the shape of the day just past, not in any anxious way, simply a quiet mental inventory closing itself out, the fire woken and now banked again, the water fetched, the bread baked, still sitting wrapped in cloth for tomorrow's needs, the cow milked, the eggs gathered, the pig fed, the mending advanced, though never quite finished, there always being more mending than any single evening allows, the laundry done, shared among neighbours and now drying, weather permitting, ready to be gathered and folded tomorrow, the children fed and washed and settled, each one safe within these walls tonight. There is a kind of satisfaction available in this accounting, quiet and unglamorous, the satisfaction of a day's work honestly completed, and Agnes allows herself to rest inside that satisfaction now, feeling her body sink further into the straw mattress, feeling the last of the day's tension begin, finally, to loosen its grip on her shoulders and her jaw and the small muscles around her eyes that have been working, in one way or another, since before the sun came up. Sleep, when it comes for someone who has worked this hard across this many hours, tends to come quickly and completely, without the restless circling that sometimes plagues a mind with too little to occupy it during waking hours. Agnes's mind has had more than enough to occupy it today. It is ready now, finally, for rest. Somewhere beyond this particular village, beyond this particular cottage with its banked fire and its sleeping family, this same basic rhythm repeats itself in countless variations, across countless other villages scattered through the English countryside, and beyond it too, across the whole breadth of a medieval Europe stitched together from thousands of small agricultural communities that most history books never bother to name individually. In a village further north, where the winter bites harder and earlier, another woman not so different from Agnes is likely doing much the same thing tonight, banking her own fire, checking on her own sleeping children, carrying in her own hands and her own accumulated knowledge, the same essential competence that keeps a household alive through a world with no safety net beyond what the family and the community can provide for themselves. Further south, in villages where the soil runs richer and the growing season stretches longer, the specific tasks shift somewhat, more emphasis perhaps on wine grapes than on the grain that dominates Agnes's world. But the underlying shape remains recognizable, the same essential pattern of a woman rising before dawn to wake a fire, to fetch water, to set a household in motion that will not properly stop again until well after dark. Across the Channel, in the small farming communities of what will one day be called France, in the scattered settlements of the Low Countries, in 100,000 villages whose names history never thought to record, this same quiet, essential labor was happening, night after night, generation after generation, largely unremarkable, entirely unremarkable to the people living it, and yet utterly foundational to everything that made medieval society function at all. This is worth sitting with for a moment, I think, because the history most of us learned, if we learned any medieval history at all beyond a few famous names and famous battles, tends to focus almost entirely elsewhere. Kings and their wars, cathedrals rising slowly over decades of skilled labor, plagues that swept through with terrible speed and terrible cost, great halls and tournaments, and the elaborate rule-bound world of nobility, with its silks and its heraldry, and its carefully managed marriages between powerful families. All of that happened too, and it is not wrong to find it fascinating, but it represents a vanishingly small sliver of how most people actually lived, most days, across most of the medieval centuries. The overwhelming majority of people in this era were exactly what Agnes and Thomas are, peasants working land they did not own, building lives out of labor and skill and quiet endurance that left almost no written trace behind, no letters, no diaries, nothing that historians centuries later could point to and say, here, this is exactly how she spent her Tuesday. We know what we know about women like Agnes through indirect evidence mostly, court records that occasionally mention a woman's testimony or a woman's small legal dispute, manorial rolls that list names and obligations without ever capturing the texture of daily life behind them, archaeological evidence pulled slowly and carefully from the ground itself, the shape of a hearth, the remains of tools, seeds preserved by chance in ways that tell us what people actually grew and ate. Historians and archaeologists have had to piece this world together the way you might reconstruct a shattered pot from scattered fragments, patient and careful, filling gaps with reasoned inference where direct evidence simply does not survive. And what that patient reconstruction reveals, again and again, is a portrait remarkably similar to the one we have been sitting inside tonight. Women whose labor was not peripheral to medieval survival, but entirely central to it, whose skill and competence and quiet daily judgment kept entire households functioning across years and decades, whose contribution history simply failed, for the longest time, to properly notice or record. It is tempting, when we picture the medieval world at all, to picture it through the eyes of the very few who lived inside stone castles and grand halls, women whose days involved music and needlework and elaborate ceremony, whose names survive in chronicles precisely because their position gave them access to the kind of visibility that ordinary women like Agnes never possessed. And there is a place for that history too, a genuine fascination in understanding how the smallest sliver of medieval society, the nobility, actually lived. But I find myself, the longer I spend with this particular kind of story, drawn far more strongly toward women like Agnes, precisely because their competence had to be so total, so complete, so uncompromising in what it demanded of them, with no army of servants standing between them and any given task, no steward to manage the household stores, no wet nurse to share the burden of a hungry infant in the middle of the night. A noble woman's competence, real as it often was, existed within a structure designed to shield her from the rawest edges of physical labor. Agnes's competence exists with no such shield at all. If the fire does not catch, she is cold. If the bread does not rise properly, her family goes hungrier than they should. If she misjudges how long the winter stores need to last, there is no steward to blame and no larger household budget to draw upon, only the hard consequence of her own miscalculation, borne directly by the people she loves most. This is not a harder life in every single respect than a noblewoman's, since a noblewoman carried her own particular burdens, political marriages arranged without her consent, the constant pressure to produce an heir, a life lived under considerably more public scrutiny than Agnes will ever experience. But there is a rawness, a directness, to how completely Agnes's own skill and judgment determine her family's daily well-being that I think deserves genuine respect rather than the quiet historical erasure it has mostly received. Years will carry on for Agnes much as they have already, this particular night simply one more link in a chain stretching backward through her own mother and grandmother, and forward, presumably, though nothing in this world is ever entirely certain, toward Alice and Margaret and whatever daughters they might have of their own one day. Will, when he is grown, will very likely work land much like his father does now, will marry a woman not unlike Agnes, competent and practical, and quietly essential to whatever household they build together. Alice is already, at 8 years old, being shaped by daily proximity into someone who will one day know how to wake a fire in the dark, how to judge when dough has risen enough, how to soothe a fussing infant while her hands remain busy with some entirely separate task. Margaret will follow the same path a few years behind her sister, and even Edmund, sleeping now in his basket with no awareness yet of any of this, will grow into a world shaped as thoroughly by his mother's steady competence as by his father's labour in the fields. The seasons will keep turning regardless of any of their individual hopes or fears about it, winter settling in fully within the coming weeks, the cold deepening, the days shrinking further still before, eventually, inevitably, the long, slow turn back towards spring begins, the light returning by degrees so gradual that some mornings it seems impossible any change is happening at all, until suddenly, almost without anyone quite noticing the precise moment, the world has tilted back toward warmth and growth, and the whole cycle of planting and tending and harvesting begins again. Agnes has lived through this turning more than 30 times now, has watched it carry her through childhood and into this current stretch of her adult life, mother to 4 living children, wife to a man she has genuinely grown to love, keeper of a household that depends on her in ways so total and so constant that she rarely has occasion to step back and see the full shape of it, the way we have been able to step back and see it together tonight. When market day itself finally arrives, a few days from now, it will ask something different of Agnes than an ordinary day does, though no less demanding in its own way. She will rise even earlier than usual, the fire woken in near total darkness, breakfast prepared and eaten quickly, because the walk to the larger settlement where the market gathers takes the better part of 2 hours on foot, longer if the roads have turned muddy from recent rain, and she will need to arrive with enough of the morning left to properly set up whatever goods the family has gathered to trade before the best trading hours slip away toward the busier, more crowded stretch of midday. She will carry the spun wool in a bundle across her back, along with the basket of eggs carefully packed with straw to keep them from cracking against each other during the journey, and Thomas will likely walk alongside her for at least part of the way before splitting off toward whatever business calls him elsewhere in the settlement. Perhaps toward the smith to discuss the pot that needs mending, perhaps toward other men from the village gathered to discuss matters of shared concern, boundary disputes or plans for the coming spring's planting that benefit from being worked out collectively rather than farm by isolated farm. At the market itself, Agnes will find her place among the other women selling similar small surpluses, and the trading itself follows its own particular rhythm, part negotiation, part social visit, since many of the women she trades with are familiar faces seen at every market, their own small talk and comparison of prices and complaints about the season's weather woven as thoroughly into the business of trading as the actual exchange of goods. She has learned, across years of this, exactly how to read a buyer's interest, when to hold firm on a price, and when a small concession will secure a sale that might otherwise walk away entirely. And there is a genuine satisfaction in doing this well, in walking home at day's end, having traded skillfully, having secured perhaps a length of dyed cloth for Margaret's next dress, or a small quantity of spices carried up from the coast by traders whose journeys stretch further than Agnes will likely ever travel herself in her whole life. Dyeing cloth, when the household manages to afford the materials for it, opens up a whole further layer of skill that Agnes has slowly built across years of practice, learning which plants yield which colors and how to fix them properly so the dye does not simply wash away with the first hard rain. Woad, grown sometimes in a corner of the garden or traded for at market, produces a rich deep blue that requires a genuinely involved process of fermentation to unlock properly. Madder root gives a warm red, weld a clear yellow, and various barks and lichens contribute their own suppler shades of brown and grey and green, each requiring its own particular knowledge about preparation and timing, and the mordant, often a mixture involving alum, needed to help the colour bind properly to the wool or linen fibre. Most of Agnes's family's clothing remains undyed, the natural cream and brown of the wool and linen itself, dyeing being an expense of both money and time that a household like hers can only occasionally justify, saved mostly for something special, a piece of cloth destined for church wear or for a daughter's wedding one day, whenever that day eventually comes. She thinks too of Joan, Cecily's daughter, who helped organise this morning's laundry, and who is nearing the age when marriage negotiations will likely begin in earnest, and this thought carries Agnes's mind toward another whole dimension of her role within the village, one that extends beyond her own household's needs entirely. She has attended 3 births in the past 2 years alone, called upon alongside the village's more formally recognised midwife whenever an extra pair of steady, experienced hands proves useful, and this work, unpaid in any direct sense though generally repaid eventually through the same web of mutual obligation that runs through everything else in village life, has taught her things about the body, and about crisis, and about the particular calm required to be useful when someone else's fear threatens to overwhelm a room, that no amount of formal medical training, had such a thing even been available to her, could have taught more thoroughly. One birth in particular stays with her, a young woman named Isabel, who married into the village only 2 years back, her labour stretching long through a bitter January night, fear plain on her face as the hours dragged past midnight, with no sign of the child arriving. Agnes had been sent for around midnight, Cecily's own knees no longer allowing her to kneel for the many hours a difficult birth sometimes demands, and Agnes had spent the remaining hours of that night doing what she could, holding Isabel's hand through the worst of the pains, helping her walk slow circuits of the small room whenever the midwife judged that movement would help ease the baby's descent, murmuring whatever quiet reassurance she could manage, even as her own private worry grew alongside the hours passing. The child came finally as the first grey light of dawn crept through the shutters, a girl, small but breathing well, and crying with the particular strong, indignant cry that every mother in that room recognised with relief as a genuinely good sign. Agnes remembers the specific quality of the light in that room at the moment the baby was finally placed in Isabel's arms, remembers the exhausted, transformed look on the young mother's face, something that looked almost like disbelief mixed with a fierce, sudden tenderness, an expression Agnes has seen now on enough new mothers' faces to recognise it instantly, having worn it herself 4 times over across her own years of childbearing. She had walked home that morning, bone-tired, the whole village still mostly asleep around her, and there had been something in that walk, the cold morning air, the particular satisfaction of having been useful in a moment that mattered enormously to someone else, that she carries with her still, resurfacing now in this quiet moment before sleep. This kind of knowledge, gathered across years of attending births and tending illness within her own household and her neighbours both, sits alongside her garden knowledge as part of the same broader expertise, medicine and food and care for the body treated as facets of a single continuous body of practical wisdom, rather than separate disciplines requiring separate specialists. When Will took a bad fever 2 winters back, it was Agnes's own judgment, informed by everything she had learnt from her mother and from years of practical experience, that guided how she treated him. Willow bark for the fever itself, feverfew for the accompanying headache, careful attention to keeping him warm without overheating him further, and a steady, patient vigilance through several genuinely frightening nights until the fever finally broke and his recovery began in earnest. She does not think of herself as a healer in any formal sense, would likely be surprised if anyone described her that way directly, and yet the accumulated knowledge she carries, built from her own mother's teaching and decades of practical trial and observation, functions as exactly that for her own household and, when called upon, for her wider community as well. There is a particular kind of expertise that develops this way, not through books or formal instruction, but through sustained attentive practice across years, through paying close attention to what works and what does not, and adjusting accordingly, through the simple accumulated weight of experience applied thoughtfully again and again, until judgment becomes almost instinctive. It is in its own quiet way, every bit as real a form of expertise as anything a trained physician of the era might claim, even if history has rarely thought to describe it in those terms. Food in this household follows the season as faithfully as everything else does, and it is worth pausing to notice just how completely that shapes what actually lands in the family's shared bowl on any given evening. Summer brings genuine abundance by comparison, the garden producing steadily fresh greens and peas and beans supplementing the grain-based staples that form the backbone of the diet in every season. Autumn, the season this particular day belongs to, still carries some of that abundance forward even as the emphasis shifts firmly toward preservation, the household eating well enough for now while working constantly to secure what will carry them through the leaner months ahead. Winter narrows things considerably, fresh vegetables giving way almost entirely to whatever has been successfully stored, the cabbages and turnips and onions kept in the root cellar, supplemented by dried fruit and whatever salted meat remains from the pig slaughtered back in November. Grain remains the true constant across every season, the true foundation of the entire household's caloric survival, transformed variously into bread and into the thick pottage that appears at nearly every meal in one form or another. Meat, by contrast, appears far less often than modern audiences might assume from popular depictions of medieval life, a small portion here and there, rather than a centerpiece of daily meals, reserved more often for special occasions or stretched thin as flavoring within a larger pot of grain and vegetables, rather than served as its own substantial portion. This is not deprivation exactly, not in Agnes's own understanding of what a proper meal looks like, since it is simply the shape food has always taken in her experience, filling and warm and sufficient for the labor the day demands, even if it would strike a modern eye as remarkably plain by comparison to what abundance now looks like. Time itself moves differently through Agnes's days than it does through ours, structured not by mechanical clocks which remain rare and largely confined to monasteries and the grandest cathedrals in this particular era, but by a whole different set of markers entirely. The church bell, when it can be heard from the village, marking certain hours of prayer throughout the day, the position of the sun, read instinctively rather than measured precisely, telling her roughly how much of the morning remains before the midday meal needs preparing, roughly how many hours of usable light remain before evening tasks need finishing while there is still light enough to see by. The rhythm of the animals themselves, the rooster's crow, the particular restlessness cattle show as evening approaches and they want bringing in for the night. This lack of precise mechanical timekeeping does not mean Agnes's days lack structure. If anything, they are structured with a rigor that might surprise anyone who assumes clock time is the only kind of real discipline available to human beings. Her days follow their pattern with real consistency, task following task, in an order shaped by necessity and by long accumulated wisdom about what needs doing when, and this pattern holds steady across years, with only the season's shifting demands altering its particular shape. She has simply never needed a clock to know, with real confidence, roughly what time it is, and roughly what ought to be happening at any given hour, her whole body attuned instead to the sun and the animals and the accumulated rhythm of thousands of days lived exactly this way before this one. Agnes thinks, in these final drifting moments before sleep finally claims her, about what lies ahead for each of her children, the particular shape their own adult lives will likely take, shaped as thoroughly by circumstance and by the accumulated knowledge she and Thomas passed down to them as by anything either child might choose independently for themselves. There is no formal schooling waiting for Will beyond what the village itself might occasionally offer through the local priest, who sometimes teaches a handful of boys their letters and enough basic reading to follow along with certain prayers, though even this modest instruction reaches only a fraction of village children and touches girls almost never at all. Will's true education has been happening all along, exactly as Alice's has, through this same steady daily immersion in the work itself, following his father through the fields, learning to read soil and weather the way Agnes reads the sky for signs of tomorrow's conditions. For Elise, and eventually Margaret behind her, the path runs differently but along an equally well-worn track. They will continue learning at their mother's side for years yet, absorbing gradually everything Agnes knows about running a household, until eventually, likely sometime in their middle to late teenage years, marriages will be arranged for them much as Agnes's own marriage was arranged for her, sensible pairings considered carefully by both families involved, weighing land and standing and practical compatibility more heavily than anything resembling romantic attraction. Though as Agnes herself has learned across her own 12 years with Thomas, genuine affection can grow steadily within such an arrangement even when it was not the arrangement's original purpose. There is no bitterness in how Agnes considers any of this, no sense of injustice at a system that offers her daughters so narrow a range of choices compared to what a modern parent might hope for a child. This is simply the shape of the world as she understands it, as every woman in her position has understood it, stretching back further than memory reaches. And her hope for her daughters is not that they might escape this shape entirely, an idea that would likely strike her as almost meaningless given how completely this shape defines what a good life even looks like within her own imagination, but rather that they might inhabit it as well, and as capably as she herself has learnt to, finding within its boundaries the same quiet competence and genuine satisfaction that she has found within her own life, imperfect and demanding as it sometimes is. Clothing itself, something so effortlessly available in a modern world of shops and instant purchase, represents in Agnes's world an entire ongoing project stretched across months and years, rather than a simple errand completed in an afternoon. Every garment her family wears traces back through a long chain of labour that begins with raw wool sheared from a sheep, or raw flax pulled from the ground, moves through the cleaning and carding and spinning that transforms raw fibre into usable thread, continues through weaving, whether done on her own loom, or, as with most of her household's cloth, traded for through a neighbour who owns one, and finishes finally with the actual cutting and sewing that shapes flat cloth into something wearable. A single dress, considered across its full production chain from raw fibre to finished garment, might represent literally hundreds of hours of accumulated labour, much of it Agnes's own, spread across weeks and months rather than concentrated into any single burst of effort. This is worth sitting with for a moment, this staggering difference between how clothing exists in Agnes's world and how it exists in ours, because it reshapes entirely how a household like hers relates to the garments it owns. Nothing is discarded casually, everything gets mended and remended, handed down from older child to younger, repurposed into smaller pieces long after its original use has been exhausted, a worn-out shirt eventually becoming rags for cleaning, then perhaps eventually feeding into the padding of a quilt, nothing wasted, nothing treated as disposable, because the labour embedded in every single thread would make such waste almost unthinkable. The village itself, laid out along its single rutted track, holds within its small compass an entire working community organised around shared necessity rather than any formal planning. Beyond the 30 or so households like Agnes's own, there is a blacksmith's forge near the village's centre, its fire rarely fully cold, run by a broad-shouldered man named Robert, whose skill with iron makes him one of the more genuinely indispensable figures in the whole community, mending tools and shoeing the handful of horses kept by wealthier villagers, and occasionally crafting something new entirely when a household can afford the raw iron and his labour both. There is a small mill some distance along the stream, water-powered, owned ultimately by the lord, though operated day to day by a miller, whose relationship with the village carries its own particular tension, since villagers resent the fee taken from every measure of grain ground there, even as they depend on the mill for anything beyond what a household quern can manage. At what feels like the village's spiritual, if not always its precise geographic, centre sits the church, its stone walls and modest bell tower standing apart from the wattle and daub cottages surrounding it, built to last centuries in a way that no individual peasant home, however carefully maintained, was ever expected to. And beyond the village proper, visible on clear days across the fields, the Lord's manor house rises, not a castle exactly, this being a fairly modest holding rather than anything grander, but substantial enough by comparison to Agnes's own cottage to represent an entirely different order of living, stone-built rather than wattle and daub, with glass in at least some of its windows, and a household staff numbering more people than live in Agnes's entire immediate family. Agnes has been inside that manor house exactly twice in her life, both occasions tied to specific business, once delivering eggs as part of a household due owed at a particular point in the year, once accompanying Thomas when a dispute over boundary markers required settling before the Lord Steward. She remembers from those brief visits a scale of comfort that struck her at the time as almost difficult to fully comprehend. Fires burning in more than one room simultaneously, tapestries hung against stone walls for warmth and decoration both, a kitchen staffed by more people than her entire village's worth of cottages combined. She did not feel envy exactly, walking through those rooms, so much as a kind of distant curiosity, the sense of glimpsing an entirely different way of living that bore only the most distant resemblance to her own, connected to it only through the shared thread of the land itself and the labour that connects one to the other. There are sheep, too, kept by several households in the village on a rotating shared grazing arrangement across the common land, and Agnes's own family holds a small stake in this shared flock, entitling them to a portion of the wool each year at shearing time in early summer, a genuinely festive occasion by the standards of this world, the whole village turning out to help with the shearing itself, a task requiring real skill to do properly, close enough to the skin to gather every bit of usable wool without cutting the animal, and the day usually closes with some shared food and rest earned honestly after hours of physically demanding, cooperative labour. That wool, sheared each summer, becomes the raw material for so much of what fills Agnes's days across the following months, the spinning and eventually the weaving that transforms a sheep's fleece into the clothing and blankets that keep her family warm through winters like the one now approaching. The pig slaughter itself, which happened some weeks back now, close to the feast of Martinmas as is traditional across much of the English countryside, stands out in Agnes's memory as one of the more intense stretches of labour the whole year demands, concentrated into just a few days rather than spread gently across weeks the way most of her work tends to be. The timing follows old wisdom about the turning weather, cold enough by this point in November that meat can be properly preserved without spoiling during the processing itself, but not so deep into winter that the labour becomes unbearable in the cold. Thomas handled the slaughter itself, a task requiring both physical strength and a certain hardened practicality that Agnes has never envied him. But what followed belonged largely to her, the long, exacting work of transforming a single animal into weeks and months' worth of preserved food. Nothing goes to waste in this process, a principle that runs through nearly everything in Agnes's world, but that applies with particular intensity here. The meat itself gets cut and salted in careful layers, packed into barrels with enough salt to draw out the moisture that would otherwise let it spoil. Some portions set aside instead for smoking over the hearth fire across several subsequent days, developing that deep, preserved flavour that will carry the family's meals through the leanest stretches of winter. The fat gets rendered down carefully into lard, useful both for cooking and, as we noticed earlier this evening, for the rushlights that light this very room tonight. Even the intestines find use, cleaned thoroughly and used as casings for sausages made from the trimmings and scraps too small or awkward to preserve any other way. The blood itself does not go to waste either, transformed into a simple blood pudding that some households favour and others find less appealing, Agnes's own family falling somewhere in the middle on that particular question. This intensity of labour, 3 or 4 days where nearly everything else in the household's routine bends around the urgent, time-sensitive work of processing the whole animal before any part of it can spoil, represents a different rhythm than the steady daily pattern we have spent most of tonight following, and it deserves a brief mention here because it reminds us that Agnes's competence is not simply about steady repetition, it is also about the capacity to shift entirely, to marshal intense, focused effort when a particular moment demands it, coordinating not just her own labour, but often a wider circle of help, since a task this large genuinely benefits from extra hands, and there had been a sister-in-law and two of Cecily's older children helping across those few days, the whole effort organised with the same easy, unspoken cooperation that characterises so much of how this village handles its larger seasonal demands. She thinks briefly of her own name, turning it over almost idly in these last drifting moments before sleep. Agnes, a name she was given at birth by parents she barely remembers now, both gone some years, taken by a bad winter when she was still young herself. There is a version of her identity that exists entirely wrapped up in her roles: wife, mother, keeper of this household, and most days she does not think to separate herself from those roles at all. They simply are who she is, as fundamental to her sense of herself as her own name. And yet there is something underneath all of it too, some quieter thread of self that persists across every role she plays, the particular way she tilts her head when considering a problem, the private satisfaction she takes in a well-needed loaf of bread, or a skillfully negotiated trade at market, the specific quality of her own laughter, which Thomas has told her more than once, sounds exactly like her mother's did. She is Agnes. She is Thomas's wife and Will and Alice and Margaret and Edmund's mother and this household's keeper, and she is also, somewhere beneath and within and alongside all of that, simply herself, a woman who has built, out of nothing more than skill and endurance and quiet daily care, an entire life worth calling good. The room has grown fully quiet now, all 5 members of this small household given over finally to sleep, or nearly given over to it. Edmund's breathing still faintly irregular beside the bed, in the way of an infant not yet fully settled for the night, though not fussing either, simply drifting in that particular shallow, restless sleep infants often keep in these early months. Thomas has gone fully still beside Agnes, his breathing deep and slow, one arm thrown loosely across the space between them, in a gesture so habitual by now that Agnes barely registers it as anything beyond the simple, familiar shape of every ordinary night they have shared across these 12 years together. She lies on her back for a while, eyes open in the near-total darkness, watching what little light remains, that faint orange glow leaking from beneath the banked ash at the hearth, its edges blurred and soft in a way that makes it hard to tell exactly where the light ends and the surrounding darkness begins. There is a particular peace available in this specific kind of darkness, total in a way modern life rarely allows anyone to experience anymore. No distant glow of streetlight finding its way through a gap in the curtains, no small electronic light blinking somewhere in a corner of the room. Just this deep, complete dark, broken only by the faintest ember glow and by whatever thin moonlight might be finding its way past the closed shutter, and within that darkness the small persistent sounds of a household breathing together through the night. Her mind moves slowly now, the sharp task-oriented focus that carried her through the day's many demands finally loosening its grip, replaced by something softer, more associative, images drifting past almost of their own accord rather than being deliberately called up, the particular orange of this morning's fire catching in the dark, the cold bite of stream water against her hands, the smell of bread rising warm through the cottage, mixing with wood smoke, the weight of Edmund settling against her shoulder as she walked him slowly around the room, the sound of Thomas's voice telling the goat story yet again, the particular way the children lean toward him even knowing exactly how it ends, the wet slap of wool blankets against stone at the stream's edge, and Cecily's laughter carrying across the water, the particular red of this evening's sunset, promising fair weather for tomorrow. These images do not arrive in any particular order, nor do they carry any urgency now, simply drifting past the way clouds might drift across a sky with nowhere in particular to be, and Agnes allows herself to follow them loosely, rather than holding on to any single one too tightly. There is nothing left tonight that needs deciding, nothing left that needs doing, the whole long chain of the day's tasks finally fully complete, and her body, tired in every honest, earned way a body can be tired after a day like this one, begins to sink more fully into the rope-strung mattress beneath her, into the layered warmth of the wool blankets, into the deep, settled quiet of this small cottage holding her whole world safely within its walls through one more ordinary, extraordinary night. A memory surfaces now, unbidden, the way memories often do in these loose, drifting minutes before sleep finally arrives, carrying Agnes back to her own childhood, to her own mother's hands guiding hers at a quern much like the one she used this very morning, patient in a way that Agnes did not fully appreciate until she found herself, years later, offering that same patience to her own daughters. She must have been younger than Alice is now, 6 perhaps, standing at her mother's side while the older woman's hands guided her own smaller ones through the proper motion, the correct pressure, the particular feel of the stone beginning to catch and grind rather than simply slipping uselessly against the grain. Her mother had died when Agnes was barely 14, taken by a fever that swept through the village one particularly hard winter, and there are whole stretches of her mother's face and voice that have softened and blurred with the passing years, details Agnes can no longer summon with any real confidence no matter how she reaches for them. But this she remembers clearly, this specific sensation of small hands guided by larger ones, patient instruction offered without much explanation, because explanation was rarely how anything got taught in that world. Knowledge passed instead through repeated physical practice, until the body simply knew what the mind had not been separately told. She remembers her mother's particular way of humming while she worked, some wordless tune that Agnes never learned the origin of, and that has, she realizes now with a small private ache, entirely left her own memory, the tune itself lost, even though the sensation of it, warm and present and comforting, somehow remains. There is a particular kind of continuity that lives inside a moment like this one, Agnes teaching Alice the exact same task her own mother once taught her, using very nearly the exact same words, the exact same patient guiding pressure of hand over smaller hand, a chain of instruction stretching backward through generations of women whose names, most of them, have been entirely forgotten now, swallowed by time the way most ordinary lives eventually are, and yet something persists despite that forgetting, something real and continuous, this specific knowledge of how to guide a quern, how to judge a fire's readiness, how to soothe a fussing child, passed forward hand to hand, generation to generation, surviving even when the specific women who carried it are themselves lost entirely to memory and to record. Agnes finds herself, in this quiet drifting moment, genuinely moved by this thought, though she would not have the particular vocabulary to describe what she is feeling in exactly these terms. It is something like gratitude, and something like a kind of quiet grief for her own mother, gone now for 16 years, and something like hope too, a hope that whatever she is passing forward to Alice and Margaret in turn will itself continue on, carried forward by hands not yet born, long after Agnes's own name has been forgotten just as thoroughly as her mother's specific humming tune has already begun to fade from memory. This is, perhaps, one of the truest and most enduring gifts a mother in this world can offer her children, not wealth, which a household like this rarely possesses in any real quantity, but competence, skill, the accumulated practical wisdom of survival itself, offered freely and continuously across every single ordinary day, until it becomes as much a part of the next generation as their own hands and eyes. Sleep, when it finally comes for her, arrives without much ceremony, the way it tends to after a day this full and this demanding, her thoughts simply growing looser and looser, images drifting further apart from each other, until at some point, impossible to pinpoint exactly, waking thought gives way entirely to something else. Her breathing slows to match Thomas's own steady rhythm beside her, and the small persistent tension that has lived in her shoulders and her jaw across the whole long day finally releases fully, her body going slack against the straw mattress in the particular complete way that only genuinely exhausted sleep produces. The night continues around her regardless, indifferent in its own patient way to whether she is awake to witness it or not. The fire beneath its blanket of ash continues its slow, banked smoulder, giving off just enough heat to keep the worst of the cold from fully claiming the room. Outside, the temperature continues its steady drop toward the coldest hour, which will not arrive until sometime well before dawn, and somewhere beyond the cottage walls, whatever creatures move through a medieval night, foxes and owls and the occasional restless dog, continue about their own business entirely unaware of or unconcerned with the sleeping household nearby. Edmund does wake once, some hours into the night, his cry rising soft at first and then more insistent, and Agnes surfaces from her own sleep with the particular immediate, practiced alertness that new motherhood trains into a woman whether she wants it or not, lifting him before his crying can grow enough to wake the other children, settling him against her to nurse in the darkness, her own eyes barely open, her body moving through the motion almost entirely on instinct built from months of exactly this same interruption repeating itself, night after night, since his birth. He settles again after a while, his small body going heavy and loose against her the way infants do once sleep has properly claimed them, and she returns him to his basket, tucks the blanket close, and sinks back into her own rest within minutes, this brief waking barely registering by morning as anything more than a vague, half-remembered interruption. This is simply how the nights go, for a mother of an infant this young, a sleep broken into pieces rather than experienced as one long unbroken stretch, and Agnes has learnt across these past 4 months to function within that fragmentation without much complaint, her body somehow finding enough restoration within these broken pieces to carry her through each following day's full measure of labour. It will not always be this way. Edmund will grow, as his siblings did before him, into longer stretches of unbroken sleep, and Agnes's own nights will lengthen correspondingly, though by then, she knows from experience, some other demand will likely have arrived to fill whatever space that change opens up. The particular way a mother's life in this world rarely offers any extended stretch of true uncomplicated rest, one demand simply giving way to the next as children grow and circumstances shift. The deepest hour of the night settles over the village now, that stretch sometime past midnight and well before any hint of dawn, when even the most restless sleepers tend to fall into their heaviest, most complete rest, and Agnes's cottage sits within this hour as still and quiet as it will be at any point across the full turning of the day. The fire holds its low, patient smoulder beneath the ash. The animals outside, the cow in her lean-to shelter, the chickens roosting close together against the cold, the pig curled in its own straw-bedded corner, have all settled into whatever rest the natural world allows them. No different tonight than any other ordinary night stretching back across all the years this small farm has stood here. If you could look down upon this whole village from some height, the way no one in this era ever really could, you would see it laid out dark and quiet along its single track, each small cottage holding within it some version of the same scene playing out in Agnes's own home, families settled into sleep after days spent in labour not so different from hers, the whole community breathing together through these deep dark hours in a kind of collective rest that asks nothing further of any of them until the light returns and the whole elaborate, demanding, deeply human business of survival begins asking things of them all over again. There is something worth holding on to in this image, I think, this whole sleeping village, entirely unaware of how completely it will one day be forgotten by name, how thoroughly the particular lives lived within these particular walls will fade from any specific record, and yet how real and full and worthy of respect every single one of those lives actually was while it was being lived. Agnes will never know that her name is being spoken centuries later by someone she could not possibly imagine, in a world so different from her own that she would have no framework at all for understanding it. And yet here we are, having spent this whole quiet stretch of time with her, in her kitchen, at her hearth, beside her at the stream and the garden, and the loom she does not own but borrows access to, and there is something in that itself worth appreciating, this small act of attention, offered across 700 years of distance to a woman who never asked for it, and never expected it, and whose ordinary, extraordinary competence deserved it all along regardless. The night continues its slow turn toward morning, hours still remaining before the first grey hint of dawn will begin gathering along the eastern horizon, before Agnes's own eyes will open again, unprompted by anything beyond her own deeply trained internal sense of when the day properly begins, before she will rise once more into the cold, and kneel again at the hearth, and coax those same banked embers back into a proper flame, beginning the whole elaborate, demanding, quietly beautiful cycle all over again, much as she has done every morning for as long as she can remember, much as countless women before her did across countless mornings, stretching back further than any record reaches, and much as countless women after her would continue to do, in one form or another, for centuries still to come. I want to take you for a little while now to a different morning entirely, Some months from this one, deep into the heart of winter proper, when the world outside Agnes's cottage looks nothing at all like the mild autumn morning we began with. Picture the ground frozen hard enough that footsteps ring against it rather than sinking softly. The stream at the village's edge crusted thick with ice along its shallower stretches, water still moving beneath but reluctant now, sluggish, requiring real effort to break through to reach it at all. Picture the sky when it is visible at all through the low grey clouds that seem to hang permanently over the village through these darkest months, offering barely 8 hours of proper daylight between one long night and the next. Agnes's morning in this season begins in darkness heavier and colder than anything October offered, and the fire's revival each morning becomes a task of real urgency rather than simple routine, the cold pressing in far more aggressively against a household with fewer daylight hours to warm itself and a much thinner margin for error. The animals need extra care now too, the cow requiring more careful attention to keep her fed and healthy through a season when good grazing has long since disappeared. Relying instead on hay carefully saved and rationed since summer's cutting, the chickens huddled miserably against the cold and laying far less reliably than they did in warmer months, sometimes offering no eggs at all across several consecutive frozen days. The garden lies entirely dormant now, nothing left to tend there beyond the occasional check, to ensure nothing has disturbed whatever hardy roots remain buried beneath straw mulch for protection. Agnes's outdoor labour shrinks dramatically compared to autumn's demands, but this does not translate into anything resembling rest. Indoor labour simply expands to fill the space, the spinning and weaving and mending that autumn allowed her only stolen moments, for now becoming the dominant occupation of nearly every daylight hour, the whole household drawn close around the fire for warmth as much as for the work itself, since venturing far from that fire's radius for any extended stretch risks a cold that this world has few reliable defences against. Illness stalks this season more aggressively than any other, and Agnes's vigilance toward her children sharpens correspondingly, watching for the particular cough or fever that might, in a bad year, take hold and refuse to release its grip. This is the season, as we noticed earlier, that claimed her own firstborn daughter years ago, and though she does not dwell on that loss openly through these winter weeks, it lives somewhere close beneath the surface of every extra blanket she tucks around a sleeping child, every dose of willow bark tea prepared at the first sign of fever, every prayer offered a little more fervently than usual as the coldest weeks stretch on. The whole village, in some collective, largely unspoken way, holds its breath through the deepest stretch of winter, watching its oldest and youngest members with particular care, knowing from hard experience exactly what this season can take from a community with no real defense against it beyond careful preparation and considerable luck. And yet even within this harder season, there remains real warmth, real joy carved out deliberately against the cold's pressing weight. The feast of Christmas, when it arrives, brings genuine celebration despite the season's general austerity, the household drawing on whatever small stores it can spare towards something better than the ordinary daily fare. And there is carolling sometimes, and shared gathering among neighbours that the deep cold makes rarer but somehow sweeter for its scarcity. Agnes has learned, across many winters now, that this season demands a particular kind of endurance, but she has also learned that endurance and joy are not opposites, that a family can be genuinely cold and genuinely tired and genuinely, simultaneously warm with love for each other, gathered close around whatever fire they have managed to keep burning against the dark. Let your mind drift now toward the opposite end of the year entirely, toward a morning in high summer when the light arrives absurdly early, well before what Agnes's body, trained across a winter of late dawns, initially expects, and the air even at that early hour already carries a warmth that autumn and winter mornings never offer. The whole rhythm of her day shifts to accommodate this abundance of light, tasks stretching later into the evening simply because the light allows it, the household's whole schedule loosening somewhat compared to winter's tight, urgent compression around a scarce handful of daylight hours. This is haymaking season, and it arrives with an intensity all its own, different from the pig slaughter's concentrated few days but demanding in its own particular way, the whole village's attention turning toward the hay meadows the moment the grass reaches its proper height, and the weather offers a stretch of days dry enough to risk the cutting. Agnes joins this effort alongside nearly everyone else in the village, capable of the work, her usual domestic tasks compressed and rushed through in whatever hours remain, because hay cut and left to sit in wet weather spoils quickly, and a spoiled hay crop means real hardship for the animals come winter, when that same hay will be their only real sustenance through the frozen months. The meadow itself, when the cutting begins, fills with a particular energy unlike anything else in the village's yearly calendar. Dozens of people working together across a single stretch of land, the rhythmic swing of scythes cutting through tall grass, the sweet, green smell of fresh-cut hay rising thick into the warm air, children too young for the heavier work running through the drying rows, or gathering the smaller stray armfuls too scattered for the adults to bother collecting. Agnes works among the women turning the cut hay to dry evenly in the sun, a task requiring less brute strength than the actual cutting, but real stamina nonetheless. Hour after hour beneath a summer sun that autumn's Agnes, huddled close to her banked hearth fire, can barely remember the true intensity of. There is a particular camaraderie in this shared labour that stands apart from the village's other cooperative efforts, something almost festive despite the genuine physical demand of the work itself. Shared jokes carrying across the meadow, songs sometimes rising up among the women as they work, old tunes passed down without anyone remembering exactly where they first came from. The same kind of wordless, half-remembered melody Agnes's own mother once hummed while teaching her daughter at the quern. The whole village eats together at midday during these haymaking stretches too, a shared meal brought out to the fields rather than each household retreating to its own separate table. Bread and cheese and whatever else can be spared, eaten sitting in whatever shade the meadow's edge offers, a brief genuine rest in the middle of an otherwise demanding stretch of days. By the time the hay is properly dried and gathered into the stacks that will feed the village's animals through the coming winter, the whole community carries a particular satisfaction that Agnes recognizes as one of the more purely joyful stretches of her entire working year. Hard as the labor itself genuinely is, there is something in large, visible, collective effort successfully completed that feels different from the smaller, more solitary satisfactions of an ordinary day's individual tasks, a reminder, renewed every summer, that she belongs to something larger than just her own household, however completely that household usually occupies her attention and her care. There is one more season worth visiting before we let this particular thread of the year rest, and that is the early spring morning, some months before the summer haying, and some months after the deep winter we sat with a while ago, a morning when the frost still clings to the ground at first light, but retreats faster now, day by day, than it did through the long winter stretch, and when the first genuinely green things begin pushing up through soil that has held nothing but brown and grey and white for what feels, by this point, like an impossibly long stretch of months. Agnes's garden work resumes here with a particular energy that autumn's preservation-focused labour and winter's indoor confinement never quite matched, the soil needing turning and preparing, the first hardy seeds needing planting at exactly the right moment, judged as much by feel and long-accumulated instinct as by any precise calendar reckoning. There is real hope carried in this season's labour, a hope that autumn's harvest gathering carries too, but in a different register entirely. Autumn's hope being about securing what has already grown, spring's hope being about the pure, uncertain possibility of what might grow yet, dependent on weather and luck and skill in roughly equal measure. This is also lambing season for households that keep sheep, and though Agnes's own family holds only a shared stake in the village's collective flock rather than animals of their own, she often finds herself drawn to help when a difficult birth needs extra hands, much as she helps with human births when called upon, the two kinds of labour sharing more in common than might first seem obvious, the same patient watching, the same calm competence required when something goes other than smoothly. There is a particular tenderness in new lambs that even a woman as thoroughly practical as Agnes cannot entirely resist, something in their wobbling first steps and their persistent high-pitched calling for their mothers that draws a soft smile even on mornings when exhaustion presses close. The whole village seems to lighten perceptibly through these early spring weeks, an almost physical lifting of the collective mood that Agnes has felt every single year of her life without ever growing numb to it. this reliable, renewing sense that the hardest season has been survived once again, that warmth and growth and abundance are returning, as they always eventually do, however endless the winter months sometimes felt while they held their grip. Children who spent winter mostly confined close to their family hearths now spill outdoors more freely, and there is a general lightness to the whole village's daily rhythm that neither autumn's urgent preservation work nor summer's intense haymaking labour quite carries, something closer to pure relief and pure hope intertwined. Agnes carries this same lightness within her own particular labours too, even as the actual demands on her time scarcely lessen at all, the garden alone now requiring hours that winter never asked of her. But there is a difference in how demanding labour feels when it is undertaken in genuine hope rather than in mere endurance, and spring, whatever else it asks of her, offers this particular gift freely, every single year, this reminder that the whole difficult cycle of the seasons bends, ultimately, toward renewal rather than simply toward hardship endured for its own sake. Let us return now gently to where we began, back to that autumn night, back to the small cottage holding Agnes and Thomas and their 4 sleeping children, back to the deep, settled quiet of those hours somewhere past midnight, still some distance yet from the first hint of dawn. She sleeps now fully, has been sleeping for some time as we travelled together through those other seasons, those other mornings scattered across years of her life. Winter's hard cold, and summer's bright labour, and spring's renewing hope, each one simply another thread in the same continuous fabric her whole life has been quietly weaving, day after day, season after season, for longer than she has bothered to count. There is something worth noticing in how completely ordinary this particular night is, how utterly unremarkable it would have seemed to Agnes herself, or to anyone else in her village. One autumn night among thousands, stretching backward through her own life, and forward, presumably, though nothing is ever fully certain, through however many years remain ahead of her. No historian would have thought to record it. No chronicle would mention that on this particular night, in this particular village, a woman named Agnes banked her fire, and checked on her sleeping children, and lay awake for a while in the darkness, before finally, fully, letting sleep claim her. And yet this night, ordinary as it was, held within it everything that actually mattered about how this world functioned, everything that actually kept a household and a village, and multiplied across thousands of villages just like it, an entire civilization quietly running, day after unremarkable day. I think there is real value in sitting with a life like this one for as long as we have tonight, not because Agnes did anything extraordinary by the standards of her own time, but precisely because she did not, because her competence and her endurance and her quiet daily care represent something so thoroughly ordinary within her world that it required no special mention, no particular praise, simply the unremarked expectation that this is what a woman in her position did every single day for her entire adult life. That very ordinariness is, I think, the most remarkable thing about her, once you actually sit with the full weight of what it demanded, hour by hour, task by task, across a single day that we have now spent this whole long stretch of time following alongside her. The fire beneath its ash continues its patient banked smoulder. The animals outside rest through whatever remains of this particular night. Somewhere in the loft above, Will sleeps the deep dreamless sleep of a boy who spent his whole day doing genuinely useful work alongside his father. Behind the partition, Alice and Margaret lie curled together beneath their shared blanket, and Edmund rests now in his basket close beside his mother, his breathing finally settled into the slow, even rhythm of proper infant sleep. And Agnes herself lies still and warm beside Thomas, her whole body finally fully at rest after a day that asked nearly everything of her, and that she met, as she meets every single day, with a competence so complete it barely registered to her as anything worth remarking upon. Tomorrow will bring its own version of this same demanding, familiar rhythm, the fire needing waking again in the dark, the water needing fetching, the grain needing grinding, the whole elaborate sequence beginning fresh the moment Agnes's eyes open, much as it began this very morning, much as it will begin every morning, stretching ahead of her for as many years as her strength and her health allow. There is no sense within her own understanding of her life that this rhythm will ever meaningfully end or change, no expectation of some different future waiting to release her from these particular demands. This is simply what a life looks like, in her world, for a woman in her position, and she carries that understanding without bitterness, has built within its boundaries something genuinely worth calling a good life, full of real love and real competence and real, if modest, joy. And yet change does come, eventually, to every life, even one as steadily patterned as Agnes's own. Will grow into a man and take on land of his own one day, perhaps this same land eventually, inherited in the customary way. Alice and Margaret will marry and build their own households, carrying forward everything Agnes has taught them into homes and families of their own making. Edmund will grow from the small, fussing infant sleeping now in his basket into a boy and then a man, his own memories of this particular cottage and this particular mother shaping him in ways he will likely never fully articulate even to himself. Agnes herself will grow older, her particular competence deepening even as her physical strength eventually begins, as it does for everyone, to wane, and there will come a day, though it lies still many years distant from this particular autumn night, when some daughter or daughter-in-law will take up the tasks that have defined Agnes's own days for so long, and Agnes will find herself, in whatever way her own aging body and circumstances allow, offering the same patient guidance to a new generation that her own mother once offered to her. None of this weighs on her tonight, this particular night, this ordinary autumn night that we have spent so many hours sitting alongside her within. Tonight there is only the deep, settled rest of a body that has earned it fully, the quiet breathing of a family gathered safely within these familiar walls, the low, patient glow of a fire banked carefully against the coming cold, and the long, dark, peaceful stretch of night still remaining before the whole cycle begins again with tomorrow's dawn. She sleeps, and the village sleeps around her, and somewhere beyond the reach of any single household's walls, the whole wide, dark countryside holds its breath through these deepest hours, waiting, as it always does, for the light to return. Let us linger a little longer within the cottage itself before we finally let this night close around us fully, because there is more worth noticing in this small, familiar room than we have had occasion to mention yet, details that have simply been sitting quietly in the background of everything we have followed Agnes through tonight. The furniture here is sparse by any modern standard, but each piece carries real weight within the household's daily function. A long wooden bench, worn smooth along its edges by years of use, sits near the hearth, doing double duty as seating during meals and as a surface for various tasks throughout the day. A simple wooden chest, Thomas's own work from early in their marriage, holds the family's modest store of better clothing and the few pieces of cloth saved for special occasions, its lid closing with a particular soft thud that Agnes could probably recognize blindfolded after all these years of hearing it. The walls themselves, beyond their basic structure of wattle and daub, hold small evidence of a family's accumulated life. A few iron hooks driven into the wood framing near the hearth hold various cooking implements within easy reach, a ladle, a pair of tongs for managing the fire, a flat iron pan used for occasional griddle baking when the clay oven is otherwise occupied. Bundles of drying herbs hang from the low rafters, exactly as we noticed earlier, their shapes barely visible now in the darkness, but familiar enough to Agnes that she could likely name each one by scent alone if woken and asked to. A small wooden cross, simply carved, hangs near the door, a modest but genuine marker of the faith that threads through so much of this family's daily rhythm. Beneath all of this, the floor itself, packed earth swept carefully each day, has absorbed decades of this household's life into its very surface. Generations of feet moving across the same worn paths between hearth and door and sleeping area, the particular geography of daily movement etched invisibly into ground that will likely outlast every person currently sleeping within these walls tonight. There is something almost sacred in the most quiet and unassuming sense of that word about a room that has held this much accumulated daily life, this much labor and love and worry and small ordinary joy, absorbed so thoroughly into its walls and its floor and its low, smoke-stained ceiling that the room itself feels less like a container for the family's life and more like a genuine participant in it. Cecily, 2 cottages down, is likely sleeping just as soundly by now, her own smaller household, just herself and her daughter Joan since her husband's death some years back, settled into whatever version of this same nightly rhythm her circumstances allow. She will rise tomorrow much as Agnes will, though her own particular tasks shift somewhat given her widowed status, relying more heavily on the village's web of mutual support to manage labour that a full household might handle more easily alone. Agnes thinks of her sometimes with a particular tenderness, aware of how thin the line runs between her own current stability and Cecily's harder circumstances, aware that fate or fever or simple bad luck could shift her own position just as completely, and this awareness feeds, in its own quiet way, the genuine generosity Agnes extends toward her widowed neighbour whenever the opportunity arises. An extra portion of bread here, a willing hand with heavier tasks there, offered without much comment because comment would only draw unwelcome attention to a kindness better given quietly. There is an older woman too, further along the village track, whom everyone simply calls Mother Elwyn now, though she carries a proper name few bother to use anymore, well past 70 years by most reckonings, a genuine rarity in a world where such long life is far from guaranteed. She no longer manages the full physical demands that once filled her own days decades ago, her own children grown and gone now, some to their own households within the village, one to a village some distance off, married there years back and rarely seen since. But she remains a figure of real importance within the village's daily life nonetheless, her decades of accumulated knowledge making her the person most households turn to first when a difficult question arises, a birth that seems to be progressing wrong, an illness whose symptoms nobody quite recognizes, a dispute between neighbors that needs some wise, disinterested party to help talk through toward resolution. Agnes visits her occasionally, partly out of genuine affection, since Mother Elwyn helped deliver Agnes herself into this world all those decades ago, and has watched her grow from infant to girl to wife to mother in turn, and partly because the older woman's accumulated wisdom remains a genuine resource worth drawing upon, particularly regarding matters of health and healing that stretch beyond what Agnes's own considerable but still developing knowledge can confidently handle alone. There is a particular comfort in having someone like Mother Elwyn present within the village's fabric, a living repository of decades of accumulated local knowledge and memory, able to recall winters harder than any Agnes herself has lived through, harvests better and worse than any within Agnes's own memory, a whole deeper layer of context that helps steady the village's collective sense of its own resilience whenever a particular year's hardship threatens to feel unprecedented or unbearable. This, too, is part of what makes a place like this village function as more than simply a collection of individual households pursuing individual survival. It is a genuine community, layered across generations, holding within its collective memory and collective practice a depth of accumulated wisdom that no single family, however competent, could possibly hold alone. Agnes benefits from this depth constantly, drawing on Mother Elwyn's memory, on Cecily's practical support, on the wider web of women who gather at the stream and share small pieces of hard-won knowledge without ever formally naming what they are doing as teaching or as mutual support. And she contributes to this same depth in turn, her own accumulated competence, still growing even now at 30 years old, becoming part of what the village as a whole can draw upon, part of what will eventually, decades from now, make her the Mother Elwyn that some younger woman turns to for wisdom and steady, calm presence in a moment of crisis. This whole intricate, largely invisible architecture of mutual support and accumulated knowledge, stretching across every household in the village and reaching backward and forward across generations, is perhaps the truest foundation beneath everything we have witnessed tonight, more foundational even than the individual competence Agnes herself carries so completely. No single woman, however skilled, could actually sustain a household entirely alone, not reliably, not across the full unpredictable span of a whole lifetime. It is this web, this community, this accumulated collective wisdom passed hand to hand and generation to generation, that actually makes survival possible, that actually allows a life like Agnes's to be not merely endured, but genuinely, fully lived. The night deepens still further, that particular stretch of hours where even the most wakeful mind, were anyone awake to notice it, would feel time itself grow strange and slow, stretched thin across the long dark distance between midnight and dawn. Somewhere beyond the village, beyond the fields Thomas and Will worked yesterday, and will return to again come morning, the wider English countryside stretches out dark and silent under whatever stars the season's clouds allow through, hills and forests and other scattered villages, holding within them thousands of other households, living some version of this same essential rhythm, each one entirely unaware of and unconcerned with all the others, each one nonetheless woven into the same vast, largely invisible fabric of labour and care and endurance that held this whole medieval world together across so many centuries. There is a particular kind of comfort available in imagining this wider scope, I think, this vast, quiet network of sleeping households stretching out in every direction from Agnes's own small cottage, each one holding its own version of tonight's careful banking of the fire, its own version of a mother's final checking circuit, before finally allowing herself rest, its own particular constellation of hopes and worries and small accumulated competencies built up across years of steady practice. Agnes will never know most of these other households exist in any specific sense, will never meet the vast majority of the people living out their own parallel versions of her own nightly ritual across the width of this medieval world. And yet the pattern connects them all regardless, this shared, largely unrecorded experience of ordinary daily survival, competently managed, quietly endured, occasionally genuinely joyful. Her breathing continues its slow, even rhythm beside Thomas's own, and Edmund sleeps properly now beside the bed, and somewhere in the deepening dark beyond the cottage walls, the whole patient machinery of this medieval world continues turning forward, hour by hour, toward whatever morning eventually arrives, carrying this household and this village and this whole wide countryside steadily onward through time, the way it has carried countless mornings before this one, and will carry countless mornings still to come, long after Agnes herself, and Thomas, and even little Edmund grown old, have all finally fully returned to whatever rest awaits every single one of us eventually, our own particular chapter folded quietly into the vast, largely unrecorded story of ordinary human endurance that stretches backward and forward across more time than any single mind could ever properly hold. Let her rest now, this whole household resting with her, the fire holding its patient watch beneath the ash, the animals settled in their shelters, the children breathing slow and even in their sleep, Thomas beside her steady and warm, and the whole quiet, dark, deeply ordinary night stretching out ahead of them all, carrying them gently, as it always does, toward whatever morning waits. Somewhere far distant from this particular village, in other corners of this same wide medieval world, other mothers are living through their own versions of tonight's quiet closing hours, each one shaped by her own particular circumstances, her own particular household, her own particular accumulated store of hard-won competence. A woman in a coastal village further north tends her own banked fire tonight, her days shaped as much by the sea and by her family's dependence on fishing as Agnes's own days are shaped by grain and soil. A woman in a village further inland, where the local lord holds different customs and different demands than Agnes's own, negotiates her own particular version of the balance between labour owed and labour kept for her own family's benefit. None of these women will ever know of each other's existence in any specific sense, and yet the underlying pattern connects them all, this shared architecture of daily competence and daily care that quietly held an entire civilization together across centuries that history books, for the longest time, mostly forgot to properly credit them for. The particular details of Agnes's day, the quern and the drop spindle, the rushlights and the banked fire, the wool sorted for market and the willow bark steeped for fever, none of these specific practices survive intact into our own present moment, transformed and replaced many times over by centuries of changing technology and changing circumstance, and yet something underneath those specific practices does persist, has always persisted, will likely always persist in some form or another, this essential human pattern of care extended toward the people we love, competence built slowly through years of patient practice, community woven together through countless small acts of mutual support that rarely announce themselves as anything remarkable at the time they happen. If you have stayed with this story through its whole long, quiet unfolding tonight, through the dark hours before dawn and the slow gathering of morning light, through the steady accumulation of one ordinary task after another, until an entire day's worth of quiet, extraordinary competence had revealed itself fully. Then perhaps something of Agnes's own particular rhythm has settled into you as well, some quieter, slower register borrowed from a world that moved at an entirely different pace than our own tends to move. There is a kind of peace available in that borrowed rhythm, I think, a reminder that whatever demands your own particular day has placed upon you, however different in shape and substance from anything Agnes herself would recognize, there is something enduring and something genuinely admirable in simply meeting each day's demands with whatever steady competence you can manage, one task following another, one small act of care following the next, until the day's whole shape has been quietly, faithfully completed. Consider for a moment longer everything this single ordinary day actually contained, laid out plainly rather than scattered across the many hours we have spent following it. A fire woken from banked embers before any hint of dawn, water carried from a cold stream, twice over before the morning had properly begun, grain ground by hand, patient turn after patient turn of a stone quern, bread shaped and baked in a small clay oven built by a father-in-law 2 decades gone, a cow milked, chickens fed, eggs gathered, a pig tended toward its eventual purpose, an infant nursed, not once but several times across the day and into the night, dishes scrubbed with sand and ash, a garden checked and harvested, herbs gathered and considered for their medicine as much as their flavor, wool spun whenever a spare moment allowed it, a shared morning of communal laundry, heavy wet wool wrung out with aching hands beside a cold stream, a midday meal prepared and served, mending taken up and set down and taken up again, firewood gathered from the village's edge, rushlights dipped and set to harden, a supper cooked rich enough to carry the family through the night, a story told by firelight, worn smooth from years of retelling, 3 children settled to sleep, tucked and checked and settled again, a fire banked once more against the coming cold, and finally, after all of that, a body allowed at long last to rest. No single one of these tasks, considered in isolation, would strike anyone as remarkable. Grinding grain is simply grinding grain. Mending a shirt is simply mending a shirt. But consider them together. Consider the sheer accumulated weight of everything this one woman carried across this one ordinary day, and something genuinely striking emerges from that accumulation. A portrait of competence so total, so uninterrupted, so thoroughly essential to her family's survival that it becomes almost difficult to hold in mind all at once. This was not an unusual day for Agnes. This was simply Tuesday, or perhaps Wednesday, indistinguishable in its essential shape from the day before it and the day that will follow it tomorrow, remarkable only in the sense that we happened, tonight, to slow down enough to actually notice everything it contained. There is one last thing before we let this night finally close around us completely, and it concerns the particular quality of trust that runs beneath everything we have watched unfold tonight. Agnes trusts the fire will hold if she banks it properly. She trusts the stores she has preserved will carry her family through to spring, provided no unforeseen disaster intervenes. She trusts Thomas to return from the fields each evening, trusts Will to grow steadily into his own competence, trusts Elise and Margaret to absorb, gradually and without much formal teaching, everything they will eventually need to know. She trusts Cecily and Mother Elwyn and the whole wider web of village relationships to hold firm should her own household ever need their support. None of this trust is naive. She has watched enough hardship, buried enough loss, weathered enough difficult winters to understand fully how fragile any of it could prove to be, how quickly illness or bad weather or simple misfortune could unravel even the most carefully tended household, and yet she trusts anyway, extends her care and her labour forward each day on the reasonable faith that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough for that care to matter, that the accumulated wisdom she carries will continue proving sound, that the community she belongs to will continue holding steady around her own small, essential contribution to its collective survival. This is perhaps one of the quieter forms of courage available to a person in Agnes's position, this willingness to keep tending a fire, keep preserving stores, keep teaching daughters and nursing infants and mending torn shirts, without any guarantee at all that the effort will be rewarded, without any certainty beyond the accumulated evidence of her own past experience that this particular pattern of labor and care tends on the whole, across most years, to produce a life worth living. She has buried a daughter and survived that loss. She has weathered winters harder than this one promises to be. She has watched neighbors struggle through illness and hardship, and mostly, though not always, come through the other side of it, and still she rises each morning and kneels at the hearth and coaxes the fire back to life. Still she carries water and grinds grain and tends her garden and teaches her children. This same steady, faithful, unglamorous devotion, renewed fresh each single day, regardless of whatever uncertainty the future might actually hold. I think there is something in that particular quality, that patient, unglamorous, daily faithfulness, that deserves to be named clearly before we let this story rest for tonight. It would be easy to tell Agnes's story as one of simple hardship, a recitation of difficult tasks endured because no alternative existed, and there would be some truth in that telling. But it would miss something essential too, something that a whole night spent quietly beside her, watching her move through task after task with such complete, unhurried competence, makes plain in a way that a simple list of her labours never quite could. She is not merely surviving. She is genuinely, actively building something, a household, a family, a small durable pocket of warmth and care and competence carved out of a world that offers no guarantees and demands nearly everything in return, and she builds it well. She builds it with real skill and real tenderness and a kind of patient daily courage that asks for no recognition and receives from history almost none at all, and yet remains, regardless, genuinely remarkable, genuinely worth the quiet, careful attention we have offered it across this whole long night together. The fire in Agnes's cottage continues its slow, patient smoulder beneath the ash, waiting for morning hands that already know exactly how to wake it. The whole sleeping household rests within walls that have held this same nightly stillness for decades now, and will hold it for decades still to come, long after this particular autumn night has folded itself quietly into the vast, largely unrecorded accumulation of ordinary nights that make up the true, hidden foundation of history itself. Let her rest, this whole quiet village resting alongside her, the dark countryside stretching out in every direction, patient and still, waiting, as it always has, for the light to return once more. There is a particular stillness that belongs only to these deepest hours of night, a stillness that has nothing urgent left to ask of anyone, no task waiting to be started, no decision waiting to be made, simply the long, unhurried passage of dark hour into dark hour, each one indistinguishable from the last except for the slow, patient progress they are quietly making toward morning. Somewhere close to dawn, though still hours off yet, the temperature outside will drop toward its lowest point of the entire night, that particular deep chill that always seems to settle in hardest just before the world begins turning back toward light, as though the darkness gathers itself for one final effort before finally, gradually, giving way. Agnes will not feel this coldest stretch directly, warm as she is beneath her layered wool blankets, beside Thomas's steady warmth, the fire's low-banked glow still holding some faint measure of heat within the room's close quarters, but the frost outside will thicken across the fields, across the thatched roofs of every cottage in the village, across the bare branches of the trees lining the stream where the women gathered just this morning to wash their wool blankets, a fine silvering layer settling over everything, the world briefly transformed into something almost otherworldly in its stillness before the coming day's activity disturbs it all over again. The frost, when it settles thickest over the sleeping village in these final dark hours, will silver the thatch of every roof equally, cottage and church and manor house alike, indifferent to the different lives sheltering beneath each one, indifferent to who owns what land or owes what labour to whom. A single quiet, uniform blessing of cold and stillness laid gently over the whole sleeping countryside. This, too, is simply part of the pattern, this coldest hour arriving unnoticed by the sleepers it touches, doing its quiet work regardless of whether anyone is awake to witness it, much the way so much of Agnes's own labour unfolds unnoticed by anyone beyond the small circle of her own household, essential and largely invisible at once. It will linger on the ground and on the branches and along the edges of the roofs until well after the household has begun stirring tomorrow, catching the first thin light of morning and holding it briefly in 1,000 small glinting points before finally, slowly, surrendering to the day's gathering warmth. The frost will recede again once the sun climbs high enough to warm the air, just as it does every morning this time of year, and the cycle will continue exactly as it always has, tomorrow much the same as today, and the day after much the same as tomorrow, night folding into morning, morning into evening, evening back into night, each turn of that cycle asking the same essential things of Agnes and receiving, in return, the same essential, unwavering competence she has offered it for as long as she can remember. One more image before we truly let go of this night. One small detail worth carrying with you as your own eyes grow heavy. Somewhere in the loft above, Will has shifted in his sleep, one arm flung outward the way boys his age often sleep, entirely unguarded, entirely at ease, trusting completely in the safety of the walls around him, without ever once needing to think about that trust directly. Behind the partition, Alice has curled herself protectively around her younger sister, an old habit formed sometime after Margaret was born, a small unconscious gesture of care that nobody taught her, that simply grew naturally out of years of shared warmth and shared sleep. And beside the bed, Edmund breathes his slow, even infant breaths, his small chest rising and falling in the darkness, entirely unaware of how much labor and love and quiet vigilance his mother poured into this single ordinary day simply to keep him fed and warm and safe. There is nothing more to add to this particular day now, nothing left undone that needs finishing before proper rest can claim this household fully. The mending is not entirely finished. It never entirely is. There is always another torn seam waiting somewhere in the basket for tomorrow's stretch of firelight, but enough has been done tonight that the household will manage well enough until she returns to it again. Every task that could be reasonably completed has been completed. Every child has been fed and washed and settled. Every animal has been tended. Every fire properly managed. Every small daily obligation to family and to neighbour and to the wider rhythm of the season honoured as fully as one woman's steady hands and steady judgment could manage across a single ordinary stretch of daylight and darkness combined. This is what all of it was for, in the end, this whole long accounting of tasks and labours we have followed across these many hours together. Not simply survival for its own sake, though survival mattered enormously in a world that offered so few guarantees, no promise of enough food or enough warmth or enough good health carried forward from one year into the next, without real effort constantly renewed. It was for this, for a boy sleeping unguarded in a loft, trusting completely in his own safety, for a sister curled protectively around another, an old unspoken habit of care neither of them would think to name, for a mother herself, finding within all of this labour something that resembles not just duty but genuine purpose, for an infant breathing slow and even, warm and fed, in the deep quiet hours of an ordinary autumn night. Agnes built this, hour by hour, task by task, across a single day so demanding it would exhaust most modern people simply to read about, let alone live through themselves from before dawn until well past dark. Day after day, season after season, year after quietly accumulating year, and she built it not for recognition, not for any reward beyond the thing itself, but simply because this is what love looks like when it takes the shape of a medieval peasant woman's daily labour, patient and unglamorous and utterly, completely essential. The night holds steady around this small cottage and this small sleeping family, and it will keep holding steady, hour after quiet hour, until the first grey light finally begins gathering along the eastern horizon once more, until the birds begin their first tentative calls, until somewhere deep within her own sleeping body, Agnes's own internal sense of the coming day begins stirring her gently back toward waking, ready, as she always is, to rise once more and begin again. But that moment is still a long way off yet, hours and hours of deep, undisturbed dark still remaining, and there is no need to rush toward it now. Let this be the last image you carry with you tonight, this small sleeping household, gathered close beneath one low thatched roof, safe and warm within walls that have held so many nights just like this one, a fire banked patiently beneath its ash, A whole family breathing slow and even in the darkness, each one safe, each one warm, each one held gently within the quiet, competent care that one ordinary woman offered them across one ordinary, extraordinary day. And beyond the walls, the whole wide, dark, quiet countryside stretching out in every direction, holding its breath, as it always has, waiting patiently for the light to return. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight, whatever the shape of your own day was, whatever labor it asked of you. Let this quiet, ordinary, extraordinary world hold you gently until morning,